It's my favourite time of the year where I can offset any seasonal blues with a self-indulgent look back at the highlights and lowlights of what I've played over the last 12 months. I managed to play a frankly excessive number of games this year, so a list like this would likely be better suited to a tier format. However, I like the challenge of having to put everything in a specific order and commit to saying I like one game more than another. But that also means that the first chunk of this list is going to feel incredibly negative, since of course I'll be going into detail on the games I didn't enjoy and why. Because of that, if you want to avoid hearing me moan for however long, you can skip to the timestamp on the screen to when the list gets a bit more positive. I won't waste your time with any more rambling. If you want that though, after the main ranking I'll give a bit more of a conclusion as well as mentioning the games which I excluded, whether it's an early drop, the fact that I'm still playing it, or whatever other reason. But more importantly, out of everything I played this year, what did I like the least? It's always tricky to put something last, especially when there's so much above it, but what really solidified my staunch negativity towards High on Life is how much it wasted my time. After seeing a couple of funny clips from the game over social media, me and a friend decided to play for it together, but almost immediately the cracks started to show. Just because you giggle at a short video online doesn't mean that the game will be able to consistently make you laugh. While High on Life is technically a semi-open world FPS, it mainly touts itself as a comedy game, but stretching its jokes over 10 hours of dated repetitive shooting gameplay when a lot of its jokes don't land or are just grating, I'd generously say a quarter of its humour elicited a chuckle, you can start to see the problem. It's going for adult cartoon, sitcom dry-ish humour, but for those jokes to work, not to get too deep into comedy theory because I don't really know what I'm talking about, but timing is important. And in a game where lines can get cut off by other lines or conversations get triggered randomly, or you just can't really focus on what they're saying because you're expected to also have your full attention on fiddly platforming or shooting, it doesn't mesh. This combined with the fact that it doesn't look particularly good, the characters or narrative aren't that great either, and the gameplay has been done so much better in other games, there just isn't really much reason anyone would want to sit through this. The only redeeming quality was that I played it with someone else, and that's no thanks to the game. We took massive breaks and it took us months to get through, and these breaks were so long because we couldn't really bring ourselves to play it. If the game is so bad it's good, at least you can laugh at it, but if the game is constantly trying to be funny, all you can really do is dryly chuckle and just glaze over. Unfortunately, High on Life exists to have its sporadic funny moments posted as reels and TikToks, and a game unfortunately needs to be built between them. There are certain people who find every joke hilarious and also might have never played an FPS like this, and the combination could work for them, but that's not me. Bound was incredibly strange, and usually I'd use that as some kind of compliment, but don't mistake that as being the case here. It's a ballet-themed platformer, and I use the term platformer incredibly loosely since it's the closest term I think works. The ballet-inspired animations, I assume are mocapped, look good, but that's about the extent of my praise. As you dance through abstract environments, you'll get bored quickly since there isn't really much to do. The platforming is barely platforming because there isn't any semblance of challenge. Sometimes the game will want you to press a different button to change your stance, but that isn't really a challenge, it's arbitrary. On top of this, the angle you're looking at changes at seemingly random intervals, I'm assuming to show off the environments in VR, which you can play the game in, and I did briefly, but the constant shifting between shots is the only thing that actually made me feel unwell in VR, so that artistic choice ends up working against the game. I hate to say this because it feels nasty and a bit too judgmental, but it all comes across a bit pretentious. There's sporadic flashbacks to a pregnant woman on the beach with no explanation, occasional visions of a different side story, and apparently something is happening in the world of the ballet dancer too, but it was all kept so intentionally abstract that there was nothing to grab you and make you want to keep playing. Bound managed to give me a headache even though it really felt like it wasn't doing anything at all. At least High on Life had a bit more going on, even if I didn't like much of it, but the reason why I can forgive Bound a tiny bit more is that it was at least shorter. In spite of this limited scope, it ends up feeling like more of a tech demo than any real game, since there's so little substance, but at least the music is okay, so that's something. In Entwined, you move your two joysticks to control a bird and fish simultaneously, and you do this to hit targets and avoid obstacles. After doing this successfully enough times in a row, you'll be transported into a 3D open space where you can fly around collecting orbs of light until you have enough of those and then load into the next level. Repeat about 9 or so times until the game lets you go. I don't like complaining, and I would prefer it if games were good, but the control scheme for this game stops its incredibly basic premise from being enjoyable, and the structure built around it doesn't help either. In early levels, hitting the targets is simple, so simple it's not engaging, barely a game at all. Then the later levels require so much precision to hit the targets while simultaneously using both joysticks it's borderline impossible to get a hang of, and since your progress through the levels depletes if you mess up, the later levels can stretch out far longer than they should, that by the end you're grinding your teeth trying to ensure you hit every combo of targets perfectly, praying that neither of your thumbs twitch or slip, losing you valuable minutes of progress and more time you could not be playing Entwined. It looks nice enough, especially for a game that's now 10 years old, and the music is pleasant if not mind-numbingly repetitive in the later levels. Even if it does look enjoyable to you though, it's pretty hard to buy, since you can only get it when you have PlayStation Plus Premium, and it's otherwise unavailable for purchase, so at least you never have to technically pay for Entwined directly, but you'll never get back the time you spent playing it either. I was hopeful for Pilotwings Resort, especially since it wasn't just a reboot of the Pilotwings series, but also the closest thing we likely have to a Wii Sports Resort sequel as well. It was a first-party Nintendo launch title for the 3DS, so you would assume that it has a lot of effort behind it to show off everything the console can do, and while it does display some unique 3DS features, that's kind of it. Pilotwings Resort feels like it was put together to exist on model 3DSs tethered to platforms at conventions to play for 5 minutes while a friendly person with a 3DS t-shirt and Nintendo lanyard stands nearby and tells you about how cool glasses-free 3D is. But if you're at home and you play past the first 5 minutes, you realise that there isn't much substance. The game consists of challenges that task you with completing timed courses to earn a star rating using the different types of aerial transport available. Some of these are fun, while others are of course infuriating. This wouldn't be much of a problem if it weren't for the fact that you unlock these challenges in tiered groups by getting enough stars in one tier to unlock the next. I genuinely despise games that use a structure like this, because you get to play the fun levels once and then you spend ages repeating and perfecting the awkward unfun levels to play more of the game and will eventually end up in the same trap again. I understand a game wanting to challenge you and not just glide through the game doing badly at everything until you reach credits, but there's a balance the game needs to hit to make the game still be enjoyable and not a constant chain of punishment. And since Pilotwings Resort gets strict with its timings quite early on, it fails that balance and the wind is quickly blown out of its sails. If you want a fun and relaxing way to fly around Woohoo Island, Island Flyover from Wii Sports Resort is still the best way to do so, which is a shame since you'd assume that a game solely focused on flying from a couple of years later would have it beat, but unfortunately that's not the case. The quickest way to take the fun out of a game is to make it feel like a chore, and with a game as bright and charming as Mario & Luigi Brothership, it seems like that would be the farthest thing, but thanks to its structure it felt tortuous. The core of all my issues with Brothership stemmed from the fact that it should have been about half as long as it was. The island hopping adventure to reconnect the land of Concordia had so much potential, but the abundance of filler islands, constant pace-killing pauses in gameplay for occasionally entertaining but mostly just drawn out dialogue, and a small pool of enemies leading to repetitive feeling battles all could have been fixed if the game had less time to fill. The star of the Mario & Luigi games is the combat, and while it was fun at times with bosses being a clear highlight, it mostly felt samey. On top of the aforementioned limited variety of enemies, there also aren't that many new abilities unlocked throughout the game, and there are massive gaps in gameplay before you get new ones. And while battle plugs seem like an interesting and diverse method of passively buffing your party, they unfortunately felt a bit too gimmicky and unintuitive to really get involved in any strategy. It really sucks because the game looks amazing. Some of the islands were a lot of fun to explore, and while Luigi logic was undeniably a gimmick, it was also behind some of the funniest moments in the game. But because of how slow and mindless it often felt, just thinking about picking it back up was draining. While I haven't actually looked at them in detail myself, I know the reviews for Brothership were pretty mixed, and I get that, since I think if you're a more patient person than me, or if you were given a review copy for free and it's your job to play it, you could have a better time. Maybe this is just meant to be baby's first RPG, and I'm just a burnt out jaded adult who demands more substance and better pacing. The problem is there were loads of amazing ideas and a beautiful coat of paint here, but the way it was all strung together didn't work. You know what you're getting with Super Monkey Ball, and Banana Blitz is no difference, with the only real standout being some bosses, which were occasionally fun but didn't really break the formula too much. And also playing Monkey Ball with someone else can also be a lot of fun, so me and a friend played through it alternating with each new level or death, and that worked for most of the game. Most of my issues with games I've disliked this year have been more broad, but where I lost hope for Monkey Ball Banana Blitz was one specific moment: World 7 Level 4. With a 2-minute time limit, you need to carefully get down a plummeting spiral, and after reaching the bottom, work down a thin twisting pathway to get to the goal. The problem is that once you reach the pathway halfway through the level, gravity seems to bug out. It's worth mentioning this is the original Wii version of the game, so of course motion controls were a factor, but with the rest of the game controlling fine up to this point, there seems to be something specifically wrong with this pathway. As soon as you attempt to roll down this tiny track, you essentially lose all control and will immediately slip off, fall into the lava and be forced back to the top of the level. It doesn't help that the only solution when looking online to see if there's a trick to it is to just try a running jump from the top of the level and hope you reach the goal, skipping the entire track. but thanks to how much precision or luck is required for this, the Wii motion controls made achieving this practically impossible. I wish I set a timer to see how long we suffered trying to reach the goal of this level, but by the time we'd given up, we'd become husks of our former selves and couldn't look at a monkey or a ball without dry heaving. I don't know how Banana Blitz for the Wii shipped with such a game-breaking bug, or if it just happened to be an issue with the 2 Wii remotes we tried, and it notably seems to be absent from the Switch port. I'm sure anyone who's managed to beat this level will hit me with a get good, which is hilarious considering the game is Monkey Ball, but after what this level put me through, my fight has completely dried up, and I'll happily take it. Compared to all the games that I ranked below it, there isn't really a big horrible issue that hindered my enjoyment of Shooty Fruity. It just got a bit boring after a while. It's a VR game where you need to scan items at a checkout while simultaneously holding off the army of oncoming fruit with a weaponry at your disposal. It's a cute enough idea, and the early levels are actually pretty fun and a good use of VR, but as the levels get harder, all that really changes is how much HP the oncoming fruit have. To beat a level, you'll need to have the perfect gun setup as well as the perfect scanning ability, while also keeping track of your ammo. It becomes less dumb fun and more an activity and precision in a medium that isn't really suited to it. Like I said, it was fun at the start and there's nothing I can take away from that, but as it got further in, nothing had really changed except I was more bored and didn't really have a reason to keep playing. Even so, maybe pick it up if you see it on a generous sale. I was so excited for Ultros before playing it, and that's what made it even more disappointing when I didn't end up liking it. The psychedelic art style was what drew me to the game, and when I discovered it was a Metroidvania, that raised my hopes even more since I generally like that genre. I still think that the art style is the strongest aspect of the game, and the map design isn't too bad either, but unfortunately its biggest weakness is its structure. The main gimmick of the game is that after you progress a certain amount into the story, you'll be sent into a hibernation and wake up with most of your abilities gone. There is some level of permanent progression you can make, but most of the world will be back at the beginning. The idea could have worked, but the further you get in, the more loops you complete, the more grating the repetitive nature of the game gets. There's an avoidable but easy to stumble into area where every time you go in, you'll be treated to a lengthy, unskippable tutorial of the game's quite basic combat. You'll end up needing to recomplete certain puzzles and platforming challenges countless times, and it all just makes the game feel monotonous. I'm sure you can formulate a strategy to make progression more satisfying, but if you're going in blind like most people are, the story will just not feel great to get through. And like I just mentioned, the combat is very basic. For most of the game, you'll be stuck with the same pretty standard swordplay, and when the standard is set so high for how interesting and diverse combat can be in a 2D Metroidvania, and the fact that this came out this year, it just makes how boring the combat is pretty unforgivable. And while the story was mildly interesting, it wasn't enough to convince me to keep playing. I think what annoyed me the most is that this game felt like it should have been tailor-made for me. An interesting, unique art style with a genre I usually love should have been a shoo-in for one of my top picks, so for it to fall so flat was pretty sad. Maybe the game really picks up in the last third, but by the point I was getting there, I was having so little fun that I had put it down. If you got that far and Ultros really sticks a landing, then let me know, but otherwise I don't think I'm going back. Maybe it's a trend, but another game that I thought was made for me, which ended up being disappointing, was Melatonin. I love rhythm games, and the pastel purple hue that dominates this game's style looks amazing. It's hard to articulate what didn't click for me with Melatonin, especially since it seems like most other people liked it, but I think that's just it really, that it didn't click. The game clearly takes liberal inspiration from Rhythm Heaven, and since that franchise hasn't seen a fresh release in years, I'm happy that it's at least inspiring new games. But this unfortunately follows the same formula so closely, it can't help but feel inferior. While some of the mini-games were satisfying and felt perfectly in sync with the rhythm, it felt like others were trying to be a little too clever and ended up feeling frustrating to play through. And since the game is so short, the tricky mini-games that you get stuck on tend to stick out more. This is another one you could chalk up to being a skill issue, but I beat the game on standard difficulty without too much challenge, but by the time I reached the credits, I wasn't satisfied, just happy it was over. It wasn't really that I was suffering through it, just that it never really got fun enough to justify the price of entry and the time I invested, even though it was so short. Maybe I need to stop being so excited for games that look like they're perfect for me and perhaps getting my hopes up, but it's pretty sad to actively try and stop looking forward to playing games. There's something incredibly satisfying about flying in games if it's done right, and that's where Air Memories of Old shines, turning into bird form and gliding over the floating islands controls well, and there's a good sense of speed, but that is pretty much it. The flying is the selling point of the game, and the fact they pull it off well is worth commending, but everything built around it is lackluster. With a very hands-off story, all you really have to do is solve very basic puzzles and complete 3 main dungeons, all while flying between the different locations. The puzzles are, like I said, basic, all feeling like the first room of a first dungeon in a Zelda game, repeated and reskinned. If you want to turn your brain off, then this is a perfect game for that, since it won't get much of a workout getting through this. Very early on while playing Air, I had to start watching something on my phone at the same time, since giving the game my full attention was quickly turning my brain to mush. But you can get this game for pennies since it's almost constantly on sale, and for the price of half an avocado, you are getting about that much value. And on the topic of games that deliver on their selling point, hashtag Race Die Run is exactly that. You'll race through short challenging courses while trying to get to the end in one piece, likely often dying and quickly respawning, all while getting the fastest time possible. In typical fashion, the game gets progressively more difficult, and by the time you've gotten past the first few stages, you'll find yourself needing a good few attempts to beat the levels. It's a perfect game to play absent-mindedly while watching something else or listening to a podcast, and that's exactly how I experienced it. This game would actually thrive as a mobile game, since the controls aren't too complex, and it would be much better suited to short bursts of gameplay. It's on Switch, and if you use your Switch kind of like a mobile gaming device, then maybe this will suit you well. But since I only really use my Switch on the go during longer trips where I can get invested in longer games, hashtag Race Die Run doesn't serve much of a purpose, and after the level started getting a bit too precise, I put it down since there wasn't much to motivate me to keep going. If you do treat your Switch a bit more like a phone, which I don't think many people do, then maybe you'll enjoy this more. But as it is, it feels like it's trapped on the wrong device. You might find this strange, but I went into Tetris DS with pretty high expectations. The reason why is before I bought it, I'd seen loads of reviews, mainly from the DS era, calling this version the ultimate way to play Tetris, and since I'm quite a big fan of it, I obviously found this promise quite appealing. However, since it's been so long since the DS was in its heyday, and there have been so many other better versions of Tetris released since, this claim of ultimate Tetris has unfortunately aged. It is still impressive, there are plenty of different methods and modes for how to play Tetris, even though Classic is still the best, and the retro Nintendo theming is a nice touch that helps this version stand out, but that really is it. I'm sure when it came out it was truly the best way to play Tetris, and I can appreciate that, but as it is now, it just isn't. It's a shame since I really do try and judge games with their original context in mind, but it's hard with a game that's so simple like Tetris. If I want a convenient way to play Tetris on the go, going to the effort to carry my DS around with me isn't the optimal method anymore, and that immediately removes a lot of this game's appeal. But it's still Tetris, and Tetris is still fun. But not to build up hype for a video you're already watching, but unfortunately for Tetris DS, I've also got a much better Tetris game to compare it to. After doing my ranking last year, I was recommended Wuppo since I enjoyed Pikuniku. I guess I'm just saying words now. And this is just a reminder that if you have any recommendations, to let me know since I'm always looking for something new to play. I say this as a preface for my apology that I unfortunately didn't enjoy Wuppo as much as I would have liked. Like Pikuniku, it's a quirky 2D side-scroller, but that's about where the similarities end. Wuppo follows our slobbish protagonist as he traverses a strange world around him after he's been kicked out of the hotel room he's been living in. The storytelling was cute, but I think my main issue was how stretched out everything was. While Pikuniku was a 3-hour-long adventure that reveled in its simplicity, Wuppo is structured closer to a traditional Metroidvania, with a more detailed map and new abilities to unlock. The problem is, I think Wuppo is so committed to being a short and quite foundationally silly game that it doesn't want to commit to having the depth needed to be a properly enjoyable Metroidvania. I did laugh along with the game, but I realised quite early on that it was going to be a lot longer than I would have hoped, but the gameplay was remaining quite simple and borderline tedious. Its presentation was incredibly charming though, and when I reached moments of the story I was enjoying myself, but unfortunately the glue in between wasn't strong enough to keep me wanting to come back for more. I'm not happy that I didn't enjoy Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, especially since I was looking forward to playing it for so long, and I really did try. I tried so much that it got to the point that I felt like I was forcing it. I think a big part of the reason why is I like so many of Atlus's other RPGs that I thought that I must like Shin Megami Tensei, and I just needed to get a little further in and it would all fall into place. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. It's incredibly polished and it looks great on the PS5. The turn-based combat was standard and I had a bit of fun capturing, chatting with and also fusing the demons. What I think killed it for me is that the story was spread incredibly thin. I knew going in that SMT has a less involved narrative when compared to some of Atlus's other series, but I didn't realise just how long it would be between the bursts of the main story. While there were side quests to fill the narrative gaps, none of them were engaging enough to keep me that interested and ended up feeling a bit more superficial. And while what I got to see of the main story was intriguing, it was moving at such a gradual pace that it was hard to stay invested. Now that I've properly given Shin Megami Tensei, or at least this entry, a chance, I can fully understand what it is. It's a very classic feeling RPG with a big focus on tailoring your party exactly how you want to build it, with much less of a focus on the story. I appreciate the foundations it's laid for Atlus's other series, and I'm happy that it's still getting new games for its incredibly loyal core fanbase, but its structure and gameplay after giving it a very fair shot just isn't for me, but I'm glad it exists for the people that it is for. After finishing a Zelda game earlier this year, I was in the mood for more Zelda, but not wanting to commit to a whole game, I decided I'd go for a spin-off in the form of Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition. This game epitomizes being at that part of the ranking where there's nothing truly wrong with the game, it just isn't for me. But where this stands out a little is that this once was a game for me, just not anymore. I played the original Hyrule Warriors on the Wii U a decade ago when it was first released, and I fully completed the story, explored the side modes, and overall had a good time with it. So when I saw the original had been ported onto the Switch with all of the DLC from previous versions bundled together, I thought it would be the perfect way to revisit it. The problem was almost all the DLC characters are hidden at the end of hours of side mode content, and by the time you've unlocked them all, the rest of the content left is pretty repetitive. I enjoy Muso games for the most part. I played Persona 5 Strikers last year, and the sequel to this game, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, when that came out too, and I had fun with both, but compared to those two, this game really showed its age. Going back and replaying some of the stories showed me that this isn't the kind of content that I can enjoy replaying either. I think these types of games, unless you're a massive fan of the genre, aren't the type that you want to retread, or maybe I'm generalizing and it's just this game in particular. What I'm saying in more words than I really need to is that I didn't really enjoy Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition, which is a bummer since I like the original, but at least it exists as an homage to some of the more obscure characters in Zelda history, and that I can appreciate. I've really got to stop going into games thinking that I'll be a fan because I like something else the same team made. Case in point, Transistor. I absolutely loved Hades when I played it a couple of years ago, and since Transistor was the studio's previous title and also plays using the same isometric angle, I thought I would love it just as much. Unfortunately, just about everything else about Transistor is completely different. Instead of the fast-paced action of Hades, you're encouraged to use the game's strategy mode that pauses the combat and lets you plan out your moves before you actually do them. It's a neat concept, and I can see how that would get more strategic and involved during the late game, but it lacks the reactionary thrill that action gameplay you would usually have. It also didn't help that I was likely subconsciously constantly comparing it to Hades. Instead of having the vibrant cast of characters and constantly progressing narrative of Hades, you're stuck with a mute protagonist and her monologuing sword that has a frustrating tendency to speak in code, somehow saying a lot while not saying anything at all. Instead of the tight-paced progression, you work through pretty but not particularly interesting drawn-out levels, and then instead of the honestly perfect customizable action gameplay of Hades, you have the aforementioned strategy action hybrid that doesn't really fit together satisfyingly, at least for me. Transistor is a bit of a cult classic, and I can see why some people like it, but unfortunately I can just appreciate how it laid the foundations for a game I preferred while not really enjoying what it was by itself. As someone who grew up on Pokemon, I'm always constantly on the search for something that will fill the same niche, since I don't really love the direction the main franchise is heading down, and I don't think Pokemon should retain their dominance over the monster catching RPG space. So when I saw Cassette Beasts, a game that clearly takes inspiration but also makes strides to stand out, I was interested. It has its own type system, a focus on double battling with a partner, and a more open-ended approach to progression. Everything was working at the start, there's an interesting setup for the story, and after you reach the main town, the game kinda just sets you up to do whatever you want with the tools it's given you. But because of how open-ended it was, I felt like I was sinking so much time in but not really getting much out of it. The first town you get to is the only town, and aside from that there aren't really any big pieces of civilization, and you're just left to fend for yourself in the wilderness, completing quest chains and taking part in battles. I realised that I'd explored almost half of the map, but it felt like I'd barely made a dent in the main story. I could tell the game had a lot of content, but with so little structure it kinda just felt like I was stumbling along random pieces at the wrong time. This meant often ending up in situations where I'm underleveled and just as easily finding myself in areas where I'm overleveled and that I should have found much earlier. I think a little while ago the gaming sphere became obsessed with open-ended worlds where you can do anything in any order, and how dare the game have any authority and tell you what to do. I blame Breath of the Wild, but there's nothing wrong with linearity sometimes. Of course there's the other end of the spectrum where a game doesn't let go of your hand and you feel like you're on a guided tour, but I prefer games that are somewhere in the middle. Cassette Beasts is a game that is made significantly smoother if you follow a guide to give you a bit more direction than the game is hesitant to give you, which is ironic since you're supposed to be able to do anything in whatever order you want, but to have the most fun it's probably best to do things in a specific order, at least for the main story. I, if you couldn't tell, didn't realise that until it was too late. Maybe I'll pick it up again someday and follow my own advice and take a more systematic approach to completing the game, since I liked a lot of the characters I met and want to follow their narratives through, but as it is now I don't have an active urge to dive back into its world. Bramble the Mountain King had the unfortunate fate of going viral. Well, that's exaggerated, but arguably its best moment circulated far enough online that I saw it and remembered it well before I even knew that it was from Bramble. The problem is, Bramble presents itself as a horror game, and that moment is its best jump scare, so when you see it coming from a mile away it kinda knocks the fun out of that whole section. It's sad that a ruined surprise is my main takeaway from Bramble, because otherwise it unfortunately all blended together. Aside from some mildly challenging platforming, there wasn't too much game to Bramble, just a lot of walking around around some very pretty and some slightly atmospheric landscapes, and I think some combat, but this game is so foggy to me that I don't suggest you quote me on that. It's a short game and I played it back in March, so some blurriness is to be expected, but compared to how well I remember other games I played around the same time, it's almost jarring how little specifically I remember about Bramble. Perhaps I just wasn't in the right headspace, since most people tend to be a bit more positive about this game than I am, but I'm not going to let a critical consensus sway my own experience. However, there's definitely fun to be had here, I just didn't have much of it myself. A game that I doubt no one is really talking about ever anymore is PlayStation VR Worlds. It makes sense since it was a launch title for an accessory that is now outdated, but it's an outdated accessory that I picked up since they're so cheap now, and because of that I'm talking about this mostly forgotten kind of gem. Since it's a collection, I'll quickly address everything it comes with. The mode that attracted me to get it is Danger Ball, which is essentially first person Pong, where you're moving the paddle with your head. It's a really interesting concept and the way it's visualized is incredibly cool. It is fun for a couple of rounds, but a big disappointment was that the NPC opponents can use special moves and you as the player can't, and for some of the opponents in particular it feels that the game is giving you a massive disadvantage. London Heist is a mode that was marketed the most, and it's a 20 to 30 minute first person interactive action movie. I played it with a couple of friends and experience like that, it's a lot of fun. Of course it's goofy, but the gunplay was alright if not slightly imprecise, but it all takes itself so seriously that it's a lot of fun to just get through if you're laughing at it. Ocean Descent is just that, a cage dropping down into the sea and then being pulled back up. There's a narrated story version and then an unnarrated option that splits it into two. There's no gameplay really, just looking around, but it's detailed enough to be worth trying once. Scavenger's Odyssey is one of the more interactive games that sees you controlling a spaceship, moving through the levels, doing some platforming and shooting, and trying not to roll your eyes too much in the melodramatic story, which tries to set so much up for what will end up taking you about half an hour. Not bad, but ended up feeling a little tacked on. Then what was probably the most entertaining in the end was a VR luge, which has you sliding down steep mountains, usually amongst cars and lorries, trying to get the best time possible. Watching your friends try VR for the first time and immediately sending them down a high-speed road into oncoming traffic is a joy only this game can bring you. As a package, these 5 games are a mixed bag, and at launch the fact that it was being sold at full price was heavily critiqued, but at the cost it is now, it's something you should try out if you have PlayStation VR, but not really worth buying it for specifically. Rollerdrome is a third-person shooter mixed with a skating game, and with its striking cel-shaded art style and surprisingly easy to learn controls, it should all work. So why doesn't it? I'm getting ahead of myself because for the most part it does work. Getting through the hordes of enemies or racking up combos and doing tricks to reload is fun. When I was working through the game's story I was having a good time. So why does it feel like I'm building up to a downfall? Well, I am. Rollerdrome has a dreaded structure of needing to complete a prerequisite number of challenges to unlock more levels. While some of these challenges are simple enough, others will definitely need their own run to achieve or are finicky enough to really take you out of the fun. While I had enough patience to do this for the first couple of leagues, by the 3rd or 4th I'd had my fill. If I was playing every level once or twice to get through the game, that would be fine, but it was looking more like 4 or 5, with each attempt getting less enjoyable and more irritating. Sure, if Rollerdrome was less strict about its progression requirements, it would have been about half as long. It could have then saved the rest of the challenges for a post-game, but instead we're stuck with a game that is as long as it is, but half that time or more is spent trying to reach arbitrary goals just so you can play something new instead of the same level over and over again. I understand that most devs want their games to be longer since it's easier to sell to a wider audience if your title is on the other side of 5 hours long, but if that means that the game is working against itself to artificially make itself take more time than it should, then what's the point? If Rollerdrome was the only game that I owned, then I'd happily grind and get through it, but of course that's not the case, and since I had such a wide selection of other games I was looking to try, I just didn't have that level of dedication to spare. And it's a shame because the core concept is executed well, just not well enough to justify the game's strange structural choices. I'm not a golf fan by any stretch of the imagination, but when I found out that everybody's golf VR was critiqued for having an uncanny kind of flirty caddy follow you around the greens, I kind of had to see it for myself. There are 3 female companions that you unlock throughout the game, but there are 2 extra that are saved as DLC, one of which is a lone male caddy, Steve. While all of the female caddies are designed to be appealing and charming, Steve is kind of just some guy. He'll make sarcastic comments if you take too long to swing, if you go out of bounds he'll be so disappointed in you, and he's a little surprised if you do well. He'll start doing stretches if he gets bored, but if you're lucky he'll do a magic trick or let you try on his signature shades. He's everything I imagine a classic golf bro to be. I'm not sure myself since I've never seen one out in the wild, but as me and some friends played through the greens, the beach and the surprisingly tame dinosaur course, we became enamored by Steve. The golf was fine, I guess, I don't know, bogey, birdie, But the star was Steve. Every other game on this list has something I can compare it to as a point of reference, but everybody's Golf VR with the Steve DLC has something special that makes it a unique, enigmatic entity, being of course, Steve, and that can't be replaced. Rhythm Sprout made an incredibly strong first impression. The opening tracks and levels sounded amazing, especially with headphones, and the simple controls made it immediately engaging, and I was just having fun right away. Unfortunately, the game is front-loaded with its best tracks, and as the game goes on, while it starts to get more challenging, it slowly but surely becomes less fun. A game having a strong start isn't inherently bad, but usually after the strong start you'd hope that the game would find its footing and remain at least semi-consistent for the rest of its runtime. But with Rhythm Sprout, I gradually realised that I was missing how much fun I had at the beginning the further I got in. The music is entirely original, and for about half of the game I was convinced that it was going to use some licensed tracks to change it up and add some much needed variety. It turns out that I'd misread part of the game's description before buying it, and it was indeed all original instrumental tracks. I can't fault it for my misunderstanding, but it really drove home how much I wish the game had a bit more variety in its music, since after all it's a rhythm game, and if the soundtrack blends together, that's an issue. The core gameplay loop was still fun though, and if the game was half as long I probably would have rated it a lot higher, but since it started to drag the further it went, the more it dragged down in my opinion too. I'll fondly remember this game's strong first impression, but I'll also hesitantly keep in mind the mediocre body of the game too. Florence is an adorable dialogue-less game where we follow the protagonist, Florence, throughout her early years, getting short insights into the pivotal moments of her life with a couple interactive elements thrown in. I hesitate to call these mini-games since they don't really constitute a game. They're a game in the same way that a toddler sorting different shaped blocks into matching holes is a game, but rarely deeper than that. They're a good way to make sure your eyes don't glaze over and that you stay invested in the story, but they aren't particularly enjoyable or memorable. What is enjoyable and memorable is a story that, in spite of any dialogue, makes you feel for the protagonist and empathise with her various circumstances. Perhaps the different interactive elements are supposed to deepen the level of connection you have with her, but I think that a passive form of media without these elements would have been just as enjoyable. Because of that, I liked Florence, but since it was so short, I can't help but think it would have worked better as an animation. That's not to say that being a game held it back, but it didn't feel like the optimal medium either. It seems like I've lumped all of the very short games I played together, since Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk is perhaps best known for how you can beat it in less than 15 minutes. It's a low-res visual novel where you help a girl go to a shop and buy some milk. Simple enough. But the dialogue really sells you on this character and how she interacts with the world, and while the environments are intentionally abstract, it all helps you get a feeling for how she sees everything. It's definitely a lot more interactive than Florence, since there are multiple endings and how you play it changes what happens. While I don't remember all the nuances of it, what I do remember is that it had an impact and succeeded at what it was trying to achieve, and for such a short game I think that's worth commending. Also, if you enjoy it, there's a sequel with a bit more of a refined look, creatively named Milk Outside a Bag of Milk Outside a Bag of Milk, which I plan to play soon, so let's see if it surpasses the original. Unfortunately for Unravel, I played a lot of amazing platformers and puzzle games this year, so this one being just fine meant it faded into the background a little, and since unfortunately negative sections tend to stick out for a bit longer, I'm worried that my memory of it has been marred by its more frustrating moments. Controlling the cute Willem protagonist, you work through undeniably stunning locales from a miniature perspective, you use the length of your yarn to hang, swing, and suspend yourself through puzzles that litter each of its levels. While a lot of these are intuitive and sometimes incredibly satisfying, the later you go on, the more specific and nonsensical some of the more intricate puzzle solutions feel. Turns out I needed to latch onto this handle, climb onto the second shelf, swing 3 times, land on the lowest platform and loop around 4 times, not just once. Sorry guys, my bad. For every 5 satisfying solutions you'll have one of these monstrosities, and since you'll be stuck on them for so long, they do stick out. This is of course a shame, since the rest of the game is so fun, it can't help but feel like these puzzles just drag the whole thing down. And God forbid I try the multiplayer, since I was getting so frustrated by myself, I can't imagine bringing another person into the mix. I bought the game in a bundle with its sequel, and I will get around to playing it eventually, since I have to remind myself I did actually enjoy this game, but I think it will take me a while to actively want to pick it up, since I think I'm just worried that it won't solve the issues that the original had. 20 Minutes Till Dawn is a twin-stick shooter that tasks you as, and you guys won't believe this, surviving 20 minutes until dawn. Of course there's a bit more to it than this. There's different characters with unique abilities and various weapons that will handle their own way, and you can also customize your run with free stage options and plenty of difficulty customization too. On top of this, you'll intermittently be given different buffs and upgrade options throughout your run depending on how well you're doing that will drastically alter how your character plays. Okay, sorry, I'm the asshole, guess there's more than just surviving 20 minutes till dawn. There's nothing wrong with it really, the presentation animation is charming and the level of customization is admirable, but by the time I'd beaten each of the levels on standard difficulty and gotten comfortable with a specific character and weapon, I was ready to move on. I was planning to say that this game would better suit a casual device like mobile, since going to the effort to play it on PC or even the Steam Deck felt like a bit too much for a simple game, but then I actually looked it up and realised it is on mobile. My copy was free from Epic Game Store, so maybe I owe 20 minutes till dawn a purchase on mobile and I'll have a bit more fun with it in this casual context, but I'll hold off a little while until I'm sure that I actually want it and I'm not just getting it because I'm happy the mobile version exists. While both Pac-Man and Tetris are the long-living granddaddies of the gaming world with simple concepts that feel timeless, it seems like Tetris has aged more gracefully, being better suited to being ported on various new devices throughout the years, whereas it feels like Pac-Man took a more wacky approach, kind of just doing its own thing. However, if you want to play a more classic-feeling Pac-Man but with a modern twist, then I recommend Pac-Man Championship Edition. While the core Pac-Man formula is the same, it's all dialed up to 11, with levels sped up and everything feeling a bit more aggressive. Some tracks are laid out in a specific pattern, rewarding precision, while others let you have a bit more free reign, and the variety ensures it stays fresh for most of the game's runtime. In spite of how over the top the bright neon style is, the satisfying blend of gameplay is almost relaxing, and it's quite a nice casual game to play absent-mindedly while doing something else. If you don't like Pac-Man, this won't convert you, but if you do and you want to play something that isn't just the original, then this is a nice twist to the formula that will keep you occupied, but not much more than that. I fear that people only remember Drill Dozer for being one of the few games made by Game Freak that isn't a Pokemon game, or that it's an assist trophy in Smash Bros. Unfortunately, the game itself isn't super accessible since the GBA cartridge itself is pretty rare now because it came with its own mini rumble pack. This meant that as you were drilling through the levels, you could feel the impact of what you were doing. Or at least that's what I imagine. I emulated it. I enjoyed my time playing Drill Dozer. It was a pretty simple game, but the drilling mechanic was used in enough creative ways that the platforming never got boring. It's actually pretty impressive that the game was made by a team that rarely works on platformers really ever, so the fact that it felt so refined when the game is almost 20 years old now is worth appreciating. I was never frothing at the mouth to get back to playing Drill Dozer. Like, I would play a level or two, put it down for a while and then remember, oh, I'm playing Drill Dozer, and then pick it up and play it a bit more, rinse and repeat until I was finished. It was always a nice surprise to pick it back up, and playing it on the Analog Pocket was perhaps the most efficient way to get through it thanks to the system's battery life and screen. What I'm trying to say is I enjoyed Drill Dozer, and overall it was a pretty cute retro game to get through, but I'm not going to strongly recommend it since it's by far the best game from the era or its console, and it's so hard to get your hands on. Perhaps I would be more enthusiastic if I had the vibrating cartridge. I don't usually give logic puzzle strategy games like Humanity a chance since they usually just don't compute for me. I like those genres separately, but when they're combined I struggle to enjoy them. I'll try and get into the game's headspace and think how the game wants me to, but perhaps it takes too long to get to the satisfying part, or too much trial and error, that it can all feel like a bit too much effort for the outcome. I say all this to get to the point that in spite of my tastes, Humanity surprised me. Controlling the deity dog, you control your flocks of people through a series of varying commands to ensure that they have a pathway through the obstacle-filled levels. There is a forgiving difficulty curve and new mechanics are regularly introduced to keep it from getting stale. For the earlier levels it was honestly fantastic, and I surprised myself with how much I was having fun and even going out of my way for the optional collectibles. However, I think there was a moment where my enjoyment started to take a downturn, and it was when they introduced the evil people. I'm sure they're an important part of the very abstract metaphorical story that was being told, but I don't care because gameplay wise it all took a downward turn as soon as they started showing up. Instead of the levels being a chill but satisfying puzzle platforming challenge, it was all of a sudden about surviving the hordes of villains and trying to get to the end in one piece. Sure, it added some challenge, but it was a completely different type of challenge than I'd become accustomed to, and after they were in, the ratio of levels I was enjoying to not enjoying got harsher and harsher. Levels were all of a sudden requiring more precise and nonsensical methods for getting to the end, and the logic that made the earlier levels so satisfying was gone, replaced by a mind-numbing dedication to trial and error that quickly wore thin. I give Humanity credit since it gives you all the tools you need to essentially skip the level by including guides within the game, but of course if it gets to the point where you need a guide to get through every other level, then it starts feeling like you're making any satisfying progression. It's a shame since I got quite close to the end, but I knew that if I pushed through the last couple of hours of the game, my opinion would only get more negative, so I cut my losses before I would get any more sour. I'm happy that the first 2/3 of Humanity proved me wrong about my preferences. It's just a shame that as the game got more complex, it morphed into something more stress-inducing than satisfying. Cluster Truck looks like the kind of game that exists to be on the bottom half of a TikTok paired with a slime video or part 5 of a Young Sheldon episode, but it is in fact its own thing as well. However, when you appreciate it in isolation, it really is pretty fun. First person 3D platformers are understandably rare, and the level of movement and speed that you get from doing it on top of moving trucks isn't something that exists anywhere else. What I appreciated about Cluster Truck is that it knows how long the idea is entertaining for and essentially gives you enough levels to keep coming back for as long as it's enjoyable, and then a few more bonus levels if you still want to come back again. While quite a few attempts will be needed to get to the end of its harder levels, since the platforming is so responsive you can't help but feel fully responsible for any mistakes and you'll just want to try it and try it again. By the time I finished all of the main levels provided, I was more than happy to move on from Cluster Truck since I definitely had my fill, especially after the insane final boss. Yes, there is an actual final boss. While I don't have much of a desire to go back to it anytime soon, I would recommend playing it if it looks like the kind of thing you'd enjoy, because unlike a lot of other trailers for games, it genuinely is as fun as it looks. Ghost Giant will have you taking up the role of, now stay with me, a ghost giant as you look upon various scenes throughout a story interacting with the environment to help solve different puzzles. I actually have very little to say about Ghost Giant since it does everything it wants to pretty successfully. Playing around with the relatively expansive scenes and having fun with them while also working towards different goals is nearly always enjoyable, and while the story being told is a little bit saccharine, it's heartfelt in the right way and will have you invested throughout. In spite of the mature themes, it's a pretty fun game to play with other people, switching out the headset for each level, since the things you can do in VR are quite entertaining to watch. Yes, I can throw various parts of the scenery at different characters, and yes I will do it until they get annoyed at me. It's all part of the simple fun that keeps the emotional story engaging and enjoyable. Res Infinite is a hard one to describe, since it's sometimes presented as a rhythm game, other times a shooter, with a more daring calling it a rhythm shooter. In essence, it's a trippy experience where you're flying through abstract environments shooting targets on time with a simple beat, while also trying not to take too much damage in the process. It's actually a remake of the original Res with some modern polish, so if you ever wanted to try it out, you can just play this instead for a more accessible option. It's easy to get to grips with, it's fast and more importantly fun, and it doesn't waste your time with only a handful of unique levels that you can replay at your leisure if you want to try for high scores. I would say that it leans closer to the rhythm side of its genre hybrid, so if you're a fan of that genre like I am, then this is worth trying for something that somehow feels familiar but also like nothing else. For such a short game, I was surprised that I was so ready to move on after completing all the levels once, but perhaps that's just a merit of the game knowing how long it needs to be. Say no more, very awkward to say thanks to the exclamation mark in the middle, describes itself as an NPG, no playing game, which is inherently dumb, but yeah, they're kinda right. In a world full of yes men, your customized character uses the power of rejection to shake up the corporate world and essentially start your own mini revolution. There are different ways of saying no to unlock, adding some level of variety even if it's just pressing a different button. That's literally it though, you watch the story take place and you say different types of no to get through. There isn't really any challenge and you can't interact with the world aside from saying no whenever you want. It shouldn't work, but since the game is so short and puts so much effort into its presentation, which really reminds me of Katamari to the point that I was worried I would end up getting rolled into a giant ball at some point, that it does sustain your attention for its runtime. There's little to no replay value, but it's the kind of thing that's fun to play through once since there isn't really anything like it. I can't not call it a game since it's structured like one and it has just enough interactivity to call it one, but it's so incomparable to anything else that I almost think you should at least try it or watch someone else play it. Sometimes it's nice to just play something dumb and short as a palate cleanser. Flock is a simple and sweet game and it's at its best when it leans into this, flying around on your strange bird-like creature as you look out for, tame and index other strange bird-like creatures is a satisfying gameplay loop, and I appreciate how Flock achieves this. The controls for getting around on your bird are intentionally simplified by not giving you any active control over going up or down, and while you might think this is limiting, the map is designed so this level of control is unnecessary and you never really miss not having it. It's simple and satisfying for most of its run, but the only time I found myself getting a little frustrated was with some of the goal points for unlocking new parts of the map. At certain points in the game, you'll need to tame special birds to unlock more parts of the map, which is fine, but for a couple of these, well, the third in particular, you'll need to complete some very obscure prerequisites that aren't clear. It makes progressing past this point in the game very tricky to do without a guide, and it's a shame since the rest of the game felt like such smooth sailing, that a hiccup like this really tainted the overall experience. If you're aware going in that something like this will likely get in the way of what is otherwise a fun and unique game, then maybe you'll be able to prepare and avoid it causing too much of an issue, but for me it unfortunately significantly threw off the pacing that I can only really look past it so much. I didn't fully understand the Gardens Between until I started playing it, because it's in essence a pretty basic game with a simple core mechanic that works surprisingly well. While it might look like you're controlling the two characters that are traversing through each of the levels, you're in fact watching a predetermined run through of the level, and the only thing you can really control is time. You can pause, fast forward, and rewind the length of the stage as a predetermined events and moving aspects always happen at the same point, and this level of manipulation helps you guide the characters to the end. Having only so much you can do makes working out the solution simple enough, but not too easy, since you'll need to use each of the tools you have quite creatively. There's also a handful of secrets in each of the levels which adds some replay value too. While there is an overarching story, to be honest it didn't grip me that much, since I was just more interested in the fantastical stages and the inventive ways I need to help our heroes get to the end. Actually, screw them, I'm the hero, god of time, and without me they'd still be at the start of the level. In spite of how little you can do in the grand scheme, the way you can change the events and have fun in each of the stages is nearly always incredibly satisfying. While there were a couple of stages that I didn't enjoy, for the most part each of the levels were quite fun and made me want to immediately move on to the next. While it's quite a short game, I think it ends at the right time, with the complexity of the aforementioned simple core mechanics stretched as far as it'll go, just before the point of feeling overdone. I appreciate a game that knows when to finish, and that's why I still hold the Gardens Between in quite high regard. Don't expect Yoshi's Woolly World to provide anything that you wouldn't expect, but there's not really anything wrong with that. It's Yoshi's Woolly World after all. It's a charming, beginner-friendly platform with a strong focus on its cute aesthetic and adorable presentation. I think I'm too accustomed to 2D platformers having some kind of twist or mind-bending gimmick, but that wasn't really the case here. In a post-Mario Wonder world, I think my standards for Nintendo's platformers are quite a bit higher, so seeing Woolly World never really go much further than its quirky dedication to crocheting was a little disappointing. I shouldn't be too disappointed though. It's a polished, fully completed game that doesn't technically do anything wrong, but because it doesn't have much more going on except being accessible, it's made it quite easy to fade into the background, especially since I've had more interesting experiences with other platformers this year. Yeah, I enjoyed it more than Unravel, but at least Unravel was a bit more memorable. I'm happy that there are games like this that are a great introduction to gaming for younger kids, but there are ways that you can do that while still making it enjoyable to a more experienced audience as well, and managing to capture both of these audiences is where Nintendo usually thrives. But as a self-admitted more experienced player, it felt like long play sessions getting through Woolly World were sanding down the wrinkles in my brain to a nice smooth sheen. Again, that feels harsh since I was having a good enough time, but I can only hope that Crafted World, its sequel, has a bit more going for it. When Princess Peach Showtime came out early this year, I decided I would be a contrarian, and instead of trying out her new game, I would go back and play her only other time as protagonist, Super Princess Peach from 2005. This game is criticised for portraying Peach as emotional and her only power being mood swings. However, I'm here to say that this interpretation feels like an intentionally obtuse gotcha statement that was spread to put a damper on what is otherwise quite a fun platformer. Peach isn't controlled by her emotions, she's in full control of them, and uses her emotional range to her advantage. Is this still quite a strange route to go for Peach's first starring role? Yes, but it's also nowhere near as chauvinistic as it was made out to be, and having these 4 emotional stages is actually a really unique and interesting way to implement puzzles into the stages without breaking the pacing. Peach is a much slower and methodical hero than Mario and Luigi, and because of this the platforming itself is less challenging, but you'll instead need to strategically use your emotional powers to explore the levels, complete puzzles, and find collectibles. It's satisfying in its own way, and the charming pixel art helps it stand out from a game like New Super Mario Bros. DS, which tried to use the DS's 3D capabilities but ended up aging much worse because of it. The reason why my opinion on Super Princess Peach was dragged down was because of Toad actually. Well, not one in particular, but the whole species. There are 3 hidden Toads captured in each of the levels, and while there's not a massive amount of encouragement to collect them, they were what I thought was a fun side objective to complete. I did start to find it quite strange that I wasn't using my growing Toad collection to unlock anything as the game progressed, but I didn't pay it much mind since I was enjoying myself working through the game at my own pace. I was in for a rude awakening though as I got to the final level, and all of a sudden I wasn't allowed to move forwards unless I had collected all of the Toads. Not knowing that I needed them for anything meant that I left plenty of stray Toads in various levels since I hadn't been given any reason to collect them. But then right at the point that I'm ready for the game to give me one final challenge then end, I'm given a massive task just to have the honour of seeing the credits. While I was having fun, I wasn't having enough fun to replay about 2/3 of the levels with missing Toads, so I dropped it to maybe come back one day when I have more patience. This isn't a design choice we see much these days, and since every other aspect of Super Princess Peach has aged quite gracefully, it was quite disappointing to see a quite dated requirement for finishing the game. Otherwise though, I'd actually recommend it, and if you know that you need all the Toads going in, you'll probably have a longer but more satisfying journey than I did, so heed my warning I guess. I was recommended Citus Alpha by a friend after watching my ranking from last year, so trusting their taste I sought it out, and I can't lie and say that I wasn't tempted by the collector's edition with a physical copy of the soundtrack either. Then I started playing it and it was a perfectly good rhythm game. Citus is in a pretty classic style for a rhythm game with an equally standard mapping system and a good range of tracks to match. Actually a very good range, it was almost overwhelming just how many songs I could play through. There is also a story going on simultaneously, but you only experience it through text logs, so you can ignore it if you want, but it's a nice bonus if you want something to reward you for playing through enough tracks. Since I was recommended by a friend, I wish I had a stronger reaction, but it's just a very competent rhythm game. How much you enjoy it will depend on your taste. I liked most of the tracks and can pass on some of the others. If I had one main critique, it would be that the presentation can get pretty samey, especially when you play for longer sessions, but at least it's not overwhelming. But since my introduction to rhythm games was Project Diva, I have quite a high bar when it comes to overwhelming presentation in rhythm games. Because it's such a rhythm game of a rhythm game, it won't convert you if you're not a fan, but if you already enjoy the genre, then this is more high quality content to play through. I tend to have a bit of a bias against first-person games since I can often find them a bit claustrophobic and I just prefer to back up and have some breathing room, but I'm well aware that this preference is deterring me from playing a lot of great games, and one which did well to prove me wrong this year is Call of the Sea. We follow our protagonist as she explores a deserted island that her husband went on an expedition to find a cure for her mysterious disease, only to vanish without a trace. She's a likeable narrator and helps make the game feel a little less lonely than it otherwise would. The different areas you explore look fantastic, with the game's slightly stylized graphics ensuring it will age gracefully, but it's only a few years old, so maybe that's presumptuous. Each scene is filled with detailed puzzles that reward paying attention and were almost always enjoyable to solve. Some, especially later in the game, felt a bit convoluted, but for the most part they weren't too awkward. Even though the puzzles are what pace your progression, it is in essence a narrative focused game, and what I think holds it back from being an amazing game is the direction the story goes in. This is of course up to personal preference, but since so much of the game relies on building up mystery and suspense, it's very tricky to pull off a reveal that feels satisfying for how much it's been teased, and Call of the Sea is unfortunately a victim of this. But perhaps it's more about the journey than the slightly disappointing destination, but since that destination was my last impression, it does stick out a bit. I don't know why it took me so long to finally get around to playing the remake of Spyro the Dragon. Maybe it's because I have no real attachment to the original, but I assumed that it wouldn't have aged well for people who don't hold any nostalgia, but playing it I quickly understood why it's a classic. I think why I enjoyed getting through it so much is because of how fast it is. Spyro quickly builds up speed and it just makes the whole game feel smooth and the levels all move at a good pace because of it. It also helps that most of the stages are well structured and they had the right balance of enough opportunity for exploration to be tempting, but not too much to be overwhelming. Not every level was amazing, but because they were all so quick, it never felt like you were stuck doing anything you didn't want to for too long. It was a nice quick hit of something that had the feeling of retro charm, with modern polish to make it more palatable. I don't really have many complaints, I'm just at the point now where I just liked everything else more. The Beginner's Guide is a game that I played because everything I heard about it was, oh it's great but I can't say anything, or it's like nothing else but you just have to try it. And of course that's intriguing, but since it's short I thought there was no harm in trying it out. It seems like there's some honor bound code of not spoiling the game for people who haven't played it, but as someone who's now played it I think it's worth spoiling at least a little, since it's definitely not for everyone, so consider this your warning. The game is completely narrated in a similar style to the Stanley Parable, which is fitting since it's made by the same person, and has you playing for a selection of unfinished games made by a mysterious unknown who the narrator had a unique friendship with. There is also no such thing as a fourth wall. The games will be edited as you play them and explained moment by moment, or while you learn more about the relationship between these two people. The main point of contention and potential ethical issue that gets you thinking is how much truth there is behind the game, because there's no proof that this other person ever existed, and it could easily just be an exercise in unconventional storytelling. But if it is real, it feels borderline exploitative. Either way, it's satisfying when a game leaves you thinking like that, and there's quite a bit of discussion about it to sift through once you've finished. While The Beginner's Guide is by no means my favourite game of the year, it will stick with me and it's a unique method of player to game interaction that hasn't been explored before, so I would recommend trying it if you can. El Shaddai is such a weird game, and I think its lack of fitting in any neat boxes is part of the reason why it's remained so obscure. Originally releasing back in 2010, it somehow managed to get a remaster for modern systems, which is how I eventually learnt about it, and after seeing some amazing concept art, I knew it was the kind of thing I had to get my hands on and actually play. Not many games can say they're based on the millennia-old apocryphal texts, with this one being a liberal adaptation of the apocalyptic ancient Jewish story, the Book of Enoch, but this is a niche that El Shaddai fills. The hack-and-slash platformer hybrid follows heavenly scribe Enoch as he travels to Earth to capture the 7 fallen angels that are corrupting humanity to save the planet from an impending flood. Playing as Enoch, you travel through the increasingly abstract stages, every now and then meeting up with your sassy guardian angel Lucifer, who comments on what's happening while chatting on his flip phone and gives you a chance to save your game, all the while the homoerotic tension between the pair gradually thickens. I commend El Shaddai for never going where you expect it to, and while I don't want to spoil too much, I do want to warn that perhaps one of the most unexpected elements of El Shaddai, and not something you often see in games, is that it's unfinished. When you hear about games being unfinished, you usually assume that it's buggy or just unpolished, but El Shaddai doesn't have a proper ending. It does end, quite abruptly as you can imagine, but it wasn't the ending which was planned, and that's not a rumour, it's been confirmed by just about everyone who worked on it, but there wasn't enough faith in the project for the budget to stretch to its planned ending. Because of this, the remaster is packed in with a digital short story that shows how the narrative was supposed to end. Unfortunately, it kind of puts a damper on the whole experience. El Shaddai wasn't meant to be a book, it was meant to be a game, and I don't want to critique the writing of this story too much since it's working within very strange circumstances, but it just doesn't read well. The game in itself is so conceptual and abstract that reading such a blunt description of events that feels so divorced from the actual events of the game is just strange, not the fun kind of strange the rest of the game was, more strange in a sad way. I actually wish I never read it and just left with a semi-ending the game is stuck with, since at least that doesn't feel tacked on. On one hand, it's interesting to know what was planned, but the short story that was used to present it just came across poorly. But if I try and ignore that and just think about the game and also the art book which is packed in, which is also great, then it's a weird but entertaining adventure that was far from perfect, but something that is hard to compare to just about anything else. If you're looking for something short but high energy and engaging throughout, then maybe consider Resogun. I hadn't even heard of it, but after seeing a cameo in Astrobot, more on that later, I was intrigued enough to want to seek it out. In spite of the pixelated aesthetic it seems to be going for, it looks fantastic, with the lighting and particle effects truly carrying the weight of the game's impactful style. There isn't really too much to explain. You're stuck in a circular level, jetting around, shooting enemies and trying to save hostages before they die. There's bosses, buffs, combos, all of that, and the standard difficulty setting was the perfect level of challenge to ensure you're always striving to improve. There's only a handful of levels, but with how many options there are to make it more difficult, and side modes too, there's plenty to keep you coming back if you enjoy your first trip through the campaign. One go around was enough for me, since I was trying to work through my backlog, and even though I enjoyed it, it wasn't the kind of thing I had any desire to play endlessly, even if the option was there. But since you can get it for so cheap, I'd suggest getting it if you have a PS4 or 5. I don't love lumping two games together and comparing them endlessly, but it's really hard to not compare Boyfriend Dungeon to Hades. Both are roguelikes with snappy action and dating sim elements too, and they just have a slightly similar feel. While Hades leans into the action and challenge, Boyfriend Dungeon, as the name suggests, is a bit more focused on the dating sim. Your arsenal of weapons all happen to be able to transform into people and one dog, and the more you use them in the dungeons, the closer you'll get to the person inside. Thank God this isn't always romantic, for example, the dog, but it's a nice way to get to know this cast of characters. The story is a little basic, but it'll change depending on which characters you get to know, and that adds a nice amount of replay value. The main issue is there isn't much difficulty, and you can easily blow through the main story and barely get close to even one of the characters by the time it finishes. Since the dungeons are so easy to beat, it doesn't end up feeling like a roguelike and more just a kind of repetitive dungeon crawler. The action is handled well, but it does all blend together when looking back at it. The story was enough to keep me engaged, and since it wasn't that long, none of the cracks really became deep enough to cause any major issues. Aside from the unique implementation of the dating sim, the rest of the game unfortunately feels a little too similar to other games I've played, and most have done it better. Like I mentioned, Hades has so much more depth to its combat, and that alone is enough to keep you playing for hours, and all the extras are just bonuses to sweeten the deal. But with Boyfriend Dungeon, it feels like it was a dating sim first, and the combat was a much lower priority. Not atrocious, since I did enjoy the game, but not enough to make me want to go back for a second playthrough. However, the concept is interesting enough that I think a sequel that better balanced the two genres could be a lot more successful. It's funny that I played two games this year that I linked so closely to Hades, both of which ending up in an unfavourable comparison, but if anything I think that's a testament to how much fun I had with Hades back in 2022, and if nothing else can compare, I hope at least a full release of Hades 2 can make it at least somewhere near the high standard. While some games you really have to pick up and play to get why they're good, others are just perfect at selling you with only 10 seconds of footage, and The Plucky Squire is definitely one of those games. As soon as you see Jot diving in and out of the pages of his book, the core concept of the game is immediately clear and you want to try it for yourself, and you'll be happy to hear that it mostly succeeds with that. But The Plucky Squire is an incredibly ambitious game, and it's not just about jumping in and out of the book, but you can also switch out words in the book to change what's happening on the pages and in the story. Also, the genre of the game is shifting constantly as well. On top of the switch between 2D Zelda style exploration in the book and the 3D platforming on the outside, you also have sections of the game that switch the gameplay to a 2D platformer, a Punch-Out clone, a Bubble Bobble clone, a Rhythm Heaven clone, hell even a Jetpack Joyride clone, and all of this in only about 8 hours. It'll always keep you guessing and it never gets boring. That's something I can't complain about. Usually I'd say, oh, it's trying too much so none of it's done well, but all of it's executed pretty successfully, with the gameplay styles that are used the most often being refined. The storybook has a good sense of humour, and even though the narrative isn't revolutionary, it's endearing. The Plucky Squire was critiqued for being so linear, and I see that. There is pretty much just one solution for every puzzle, but with how ambitious the game is, I don't really see a problem with that. The game doesn't hold your hand too much, so even though there is just one solution, that one solution isn't spoon-fed to you and you will have to work to get it. For me though, the main issue was that the core sword combat and the standard Zelda clone gameplay was incredibly basic, and to be honest, I think the game knew it too. Almost all of the gameplay shifts are for bosses, and I think that's because the developers knew the standard gameplay wasn't interesting enough to make these moments impactful, so they switched it up. But in standard hordes of enemies, especially near the end, the combat just feels like padding. Even so, that's a pretty minor problem in the grand scheme of everything the Plucky Squire is doing, and while I can understand not liking the game, a lot of complaints about it were just nitpicks about the game not being exactly what people hoped it would be. And on paper I get it, you have an idea of what a game will turn out to be and then it ends up not being that. It's easy to be disappointed, but that doesn't change the fact that the end result was fun, even if it might not have been everything you expected. Superliminal aims to recreate dreaming to the best of its ability by bending the rules of how to complete the various puzzles it throws at you. It starts off with changing the size of objects by adjusting the angle you're looking at them, and it only gets more and more twisted from then onwards. It's contextualized as a dream therapy treatment, and that explanation is perfect for the strangely surreal environments you're put in. The whole game has a weird vibe that perfectly encapsulates the dreamlike feeling of everything you're playing through. When it worked, it was fantastic, and I was just so pleased that such an ambitious idea was succeeding so satisfyingly, but on occasion it stumbled and that ambition kind of broke the game. Whether it was mind-bendingly specific solutions for progression or accidentally shrinking your character to a size that they physically can't complete a level. There were just some moments where the effort into building such an immersive world halted and you remembered that you were playing a game and trying to reach a goal. I'm aware that's a strange problem to have, but Superliminal is a strange game, so I think it's only fair. And that's not to say that I had a bad time. In spite of some hiccups, the majority of the game was some of the most creative puzzle solving I'd ever played through, and even though those hiccups were distracting, they were always almost caused by the game being a bit too ambitious, and an occasionally misguided big swing is my favourite way for a game to falter anyway. In Goodbye Volcano High, we follow a group of anthropomorphic dinosaur high schoolers as they face the trials and tribulations of young love, growing apart from your friends, and the power of music channeled through intermittent rhythm gameplay, all while the news spreads of a potential apocalypse as a meteor gets ever closer, threatening to wipe out their entire civilization. The presentation is consistently high quality, with scenes often feeling like an animated TV show, and when there are long gaps between songs, it can really feel like you're just watching a cartoon, at least one with a strong focus on dialogue and not that much action. Because of how controlled the pace of everything is, and how the voice acting is also really well done, it's easy to remain engaged and get invested in the story, which in spite of its light-hearted style does take itself quite seriously. The rhythm gameplay sometimes comes completely out of nowhere with little warning, so there were moments where I'd gotten completely comfortable just watching the story play out and all of a sudden the scene changes and a song starts up and I've got to drop what I'm doing and scramble for wherever I put the controller down. While the gameplay was solid in these sections, it felt like a secondary addition to what was mostly a visual novel with a focus on its style. Goodbye Volcano High takes about 6.5 hours to complete, and you'll be lucky if you spend half an hour of that actually doing rhythm sections. That's not much of a complaint since I enjoyed what I played, and there's plenty of cute details like social media posts to scroll through whenever you pause, but don't go in thinking this is primarily a rhythm game, since that isn't really the case. If you go in with more measured expectations instead, you're more likely to enjoy what the game is presenting. I blame not liking Katana Zero more on a short video I saw of someone calling it their favourite indie game ever. I can't remember exactly what they said, but they bigged it up so much that I, of course, went in with very high expectations. So even though Katana Zero is a good game, great actually, I spent my whole playthrough thinking, when is it going to be amazing? It's my fault for letting one person's opinion sway me so much, since it meant I was judging a really fun and creative action game under a much harsher lens than I was for pretty much anything else I played this year. The constant rewinding is done well and makes for some great levels levels of gameplay while also being well explained within the game's narrative. And while I never got fully invested in the story, there were some really good moments where the game makes you question what you know and what you're seeing and who you're trusting, which at least kept me engaged. This is the kind of game I like, but don't tend to love unless they're outstanding. While I can understand why some people do love Katana Zero, it just isn't something I'm going to shout from the rooftops about. Katana Zero also happens to be the kind of game where you're likely to get a bad ending unless you know exactly what you're doing when you go in, and upon initial completion you're almost encouraged to replay so you can see the game's true ending. However, by the point I got into that first ending, I was ready to move on. It made it quite hard to find somewhere to put Katana Zero on the ranking, since while I spent so much time playing it expecting it to get better, I was still objectively enjoying myself. But more importantly than a ranking placement, I think Katana Zero was a good wake-up call to not be so easily influenced. Metal Hellsinger is perhaps one of the strangest rhythm games to exist, and I can't help but love it for that. It's a first-person shooter where you need to travel through the layers of hell, where every shot, dash and jump needs to be timed to the beat of whatever metal song is playing in the background for maximum effectiveness. The higher combo multiplier you reach, the more intense the music gets, and the more carnage you'll cause, and even though it can get overwhelming and sometimes you get thrown off beat, it all works together well. While there were some annoying enemies, most of the levels were fun to get through, and the challenge on the standard difficulty was perfect for my first playthrough. The only real complaint is with the bosses. Almost every level ends as a boss, and for most of the game this is just the same boss. It'll have some minor tweaks every time it shows up again, sometimes it'll summon decoys, sometimes it'll interact with the stage differently, but it's always pretty much the same thing. It means that every level of this super intense aggressive game ends as a bit of a downer, here we go again moment. That does change though for the final boss, which is much longer and is a lot more fun to fight, especially compared to what you're facing at the end of every level before it. It's a tough challenge, and on the standard difficulty I just barely managed to beat it on my first attempt, with maybe 1 or 2 continues. However, from looking at a couple of reviews, if you play on a higher difficulty which gives you fewer or even no continues, the boss killing you will send you right back to the start of the level preceding it. So instead of being able to gradually learn how to fight the boss attempt after attempt, you're instead going to need to replay through the quickly monotonous 10 to 15 minute level that leads up to it before you're granted the honour of another attempt. This flaw in game design apparently led people to quit the game, which is of course disappointing, and even though it didn't affect me personally, I could really feel the suffering reading these accounts of the game's final level. God, I'm just such an empath. But maybe it was all by design, and the devs just wanted playing the last level on that difficulty to really feel like being in hell, so perhaps it's a level of genius that we just don't recognise yet. I played a good few hours of Nier Automata a few years ago, but eventually stopped playing after getting distracted, but I've always regretted leaving it at such an awkward point since it's not really the kind of game it's easy to just jump back into. So instead, I thought what better way to reintroduce myself to the franchise than playing the remake of the game that preceded Automata, Nier Replicant version. I'm not saying all that. I think what Replicant does best is its tone. It's a bit all over the place, with the game somehow managing to balance airy, grungy and oppressive all at the same time, and it makes the feeling of your journey through its story hard to describe. And while the action gameplay started off and remained quite simple for a good chunk of the early game, there's a moment about halfway through where a new layer of depth is added at just the right time to keep it engaging. Of course it leans into the Nier weirdness of it all with unexpected narrative twists and strange character choices, but it all somehow works. And in typical Nier fashion, the game encourages multiple playthroughs to experience all of its different endings and have a slightly altered or sometimes drastically changed playthrough each time. While some people seem to think that this is something you should do back to back, as a more casual first timer, I think the prospect of repeat playthroughs is more of an attraction for eventual replay value when I want to revisit Replicant's world. I don't know if I'll play Automata next, or perhaps try a couple more playthroughs of Replicant instead, but either way I'm happy that my first playthrough has put me in a position where I'm a lot more ready to continue exploring this franchise, as opposed to the awkward place I left Automata a couple of years ago. I used to love typing games since they were the closest I ever got to being able to game in school back in my formative years, but I do distinctly remember never really getting better at typing because of them. Instead, my typing ability was just something I developed over time, but I can't help but think that if I had Epistory it wouldn't have taken as long. The keyboard-centric adventure will have you typing to send off elemental attacks to defeat enemies, all interwoven with genuinely well-designed exploration and dungeons. And it also helps that the origami style looks fantastic too. There is a story, but that's the least important thing really, as the gameplay loop of consistently more difficult typing challenges to defeat enemies mixed with the world design was just consistently fun to play through. Whenever I thought of typing games previously, the focus is always more on the typing than the actual game of it all, but Epistory really proves that the gameplay ratio can be much more balanced and actually enjoyable. Because of how addictive and gamey it is, I don't know how effective Epistory would actually be at teaching people to type, especially if they're younger, but I don't really think that matters, at least to me, when it was so consistently fun. I feel like Space Channel 5 is seen as this awkward franchise which got 2 entries back in the early 2000s, and after that its leading lady Ulala was just relegated to spin-off appearances whenever Sega was feeling generous. But that isn't technically the case since there is a third entry, well, kind of. 2020's Space Channel 5 VR, kinda funky newsflash, as the hilariously extended name suggests, is a VR game, but it remains surprisingly loyal to the formula that make the originals popular with their niche, a niche which I'm very much a part of. Since I'd played Space Channel 5 Part 2 earlier in the year and become a bit obsessed, but more on that later, I really couldn't resist when I found the collector's edition for this already pretty obscure game for a reasonable price. I mean, who can say no to a Space Channel 5 themed fidget spinner? But the first few Space Channel 5 games are already pretty short, so Kinda Funky Newsflash stands out for being even shorter. There are only a handful of levels and none of them are much longer than 10 minutes, so even keeping the VR headset on the whole time, you can quite easily finish it in one sitting. Being transported into the world of Space Channel 5 is done pretty well though, and since the call and response gameplay of the original is pretty simple anyway, it translates really well into just doing the actions yourself with the motion controls. It's incredibly campy, which of course is true to the core franchise, and the story is as insane as you would imagine, but I wouldn't really have it any other way. One thing that did upset me though, even if it's not really to do with the game itself, is that the region 3 physical copy of the game I bought was incompatible with a Hatsune Miku DLC from the PlayStation Store, so not only was I not given the opportunity to dance as Miku in Space Channel 5, a surely unforgettable experience, but I also had to jump through a few hoops with PlayStation support chatbots to convince them that I wasn't lying and the DLC didn't work and get a refund. In spite of all that, the main game, while short, was a fun time, and I'm looking forward to going back and replaying some of the more enjoyable levels and tackling the marathon mode. Also a side note, of course this game has a character codex or Friendopedia, covering just about every character you can think of in Space Channel 5 history, of course including brief descriptions about every background dancer. So I'd like to introduce you to perhaps the best character in gaming, the man known as I'm Too Sexy. It's a preconception I should really work past, but even though I do enjoy them sometimes, whenever I see a game that's incredibly artsy, for lack of a better word, I tend to assume that it'll be pretty, but not much else, and likely lacking in the game department. It's part of the reason why Grease gathered dust in my Steam library for quite some time, and even in the first hour or two of the game I found myself thinking, yeah, this looks nice, but it's quite basic. But then there was a moment that it clicked, and I was just having a really good time. That's not me even saying that the first couple of hours are bad, I'll just admit I had the wrong attitude, and looking back on them in retrospect, I can really appreciate that bias. But Grease manages to walk the tightrope of a beautiful looking game while also still having plenty of substance. The game is still quite linear, but the platforming, light puzzle solving, and occasional moments for exploration all tie in together incredibly well. That's why, after it clicked, I was happily gliding through the game until I made it to its satisfying conclusion. It feels strange to rank a game as fundamentally broken as Pokemon Violet. Yes, it works, but your immune system works when you sneeze, and that doesn't mean we should really be happy with it. In spite of how undeniably patched together the Pokemon world of Paldea is, I begrudgingly have to admit that I enjoyed myself. Because Pokemon was the first gaming franchise I became obsessed with at an early age, I think the core DNA of the series is just baked into my taste, and I'll always have at least some interest in what the Yellow Rodent and his army of friends are getting up to. But after Sword and Shield felt so bare bones, even in spite of having some redeeming qualities, I've become pretty jaded with the series and lost quite a lot of hope. So when Scarlet and Violet launched and I was seeing reports of how messy it was, I couldn't help but feel a little bit smug. But also constantly hearing people say it's actually fun once you play it, including from Jay who ended up lending me his copy, my morbid curiosity led me to try it out. While Scarlet and Violet aren't perfect by any means, you can't fault it for lack of content. Instead of just having a linear 8 gym battles and an Elite 4, there's instead a unique challenge for each of the 18 types in Pokemon, whether it's a gym battle, a team star opponent, or a giant Titan Pokemon. This means amidst your training for your team and exploring the undeniably horrendous looking world, you had plenty to work towards and challenge yourself with. It's a shame that these challenges don't scale with your progress, since it means you have to go in a pretty arbitrary set order, which the game doesn't make very clear at all, but in the big picture that's not too much of an issue. I'm not going to go too deep into the inner workings of the game, since I'll just be parroting other opinions about them, since there are so many out there. But what I want to emphasize is that even though the game was held together by superglue and prayers, the gameplay loop was enjoyable, and I think that counts for a lot. It's a shame that one of, if not the most profitable gaming franchises, doesn't put more of its money, resources, and most importantly time into the games that make its series so successful, and I hope the upcoming Pokemon Legends sequel is polished by the time it eventually arrives, but we'll have to wait and see if Pokemon eventually learns its ongoing multi-generational lesson. Not to lump them together, but this year I just so happened to catch up and play the 2 Pokemon games from 2022 that I'd skipped upon initial release. While I briefly agonized over whether to put Legends above or below Violet, I ended up going by my gut feeling, and I think Legends having something new gave it the goodwill to end up taking the lead. Both games share one main trait: they look like shit, but that's been said so much that I won't harp on it more than that. Even so, combining Pokemon with a dash of Monster Hunter works incredibly well, and even though I think the different biomes could have been stitched together, I also understand why it might not have been feasible. Just like Violet though, I'm impressed with how much content it's included, with this being Pokemon's first foray into having actual fleshed out side quests. It meant that there was plenty to do if you wanted to make this game longer. While I appreciated that option, I was also happy that you could do the opposite, and the default difficulty is balanced enough that most of the battles in the main story will keep your team appropriately leveled, so that you can almost exclusively focus on the main story and still have a satisfying, more linear experience. And also with a pretty hefty post-game, there's just a lot here to sink your teeth into, and that can't be said for most mainline Pokemon. This new formula works so well, even if this was a very unrefined first attempt at it. That's why I'm so happy that it's getting another chance in Kalos, hopefully next year, but even if it gets delayed, maybe I'm just shallow, but I hope it at least looks presentable. Donut County is cut from the same perpetually growing goofy destruction cloth as Katamari, and for that it immediately scores points. I wouldn't be surprised if this becomes a series in the same way, giving you a new set of scenes to destroy with every new entry. What I did find morbidly entertaining though is that there is a much more involved story than Katamari, with each wave of destruction followed by what happens down the hole you're dragging everything into. While the writing, now I promise I'm not ageist, is quite millennial core, it's interesting enough to keep you intrigued. But even without a story, Donut County doesn't need a narrative hook to keep you interested, since the core gameplay is entertaining enough to keep you wanting to come back. What I didn't expect though is there would be some level of strategy required at certain points. It doesn't feel like much of a spoiler, but there are moments where different objects will end up coming out of the donut, not just going in. This makes a lot of the later levels a little more challenging, but it never strays too far from the core chaotic energy that carries the game forwards. Since Donut County so confidently delivers on what it advertises, I can't really say anything other than that. If it looks like the kind of thing you'll find fun, which it should, then you'll likely enjoy it. Jay, who you might know from voicing the quotes in some of my other videos if you've been watching for a little while, has been recommending Little Nightmares essentially since I first met him, so this year I finally relented and gave it a go. I promise that I don't have a gun to my head when I say I had a great time playing through it in pretty much one sitting. The atmosphere is perhaps what's most impressive, with each of its 4 main levels being intricately crafted to make you feel a certain way, and the platforming and stealth strikes a perfect balance between challenge and fairness, which isn't always an easy task given how many games have groan-worthy stealth sections. In spite of how grotesque a lot of the game is, I didn't really succumb to the horror aspect of it at all, since I was playing it with 2 other people in the room while chatting, and I think that does ease the scariness considerably. If I played alone in the dark, I probably would have been jumping at every scare, but in a well-lit communal setting, it's easier to just laugh at the hulking, disgusting enemies that want to kill poor Six as soon as I see her. While I praise the platforming, it is worth mentioning that the 2.5D perspective that the game uses is mostly effective. It did lead to some slightly unfair feeling sections in the early game especially, but once I got used to the sense of depth, it wasn't too bothersome. I'm happy that such a small game has managed to generate such a strong fanbase that there's a sequel and a third on the way, and even spin-off media, and from what I've seen so far, it definitely deserves the attention. I expected very little from Bad End Theatre, getting it as part of a bundle and not really thinking much of the presentation I'd seen, but once I actually started playing the short game, I was pleasantly surprised by just how much it pulled off what it was going for. You follow a day or so in the life of 4 different characters in a story: the hero, maiden, overlord and underling, as they interact with each other in various ways, always ending in some sort of tragedy. You can start with whoever you want, making different decisions on your run to an inevitably bad ending, but as you do so, depending on the outcome, you can unlock one of the 4 moods for each of the characters, like diplomatic for the hero or antisocial for the overlord. After reaching as many endings as possible with just the default settings, you can then experiment by choosing different moods for the other characters when playing as another, and seeing how they interact differently when you make the same choices. For example, you can make the exact same dialogue choice when playing the maiden and talking to the underling, but if you make him hungry, he's going to eat her no matter what she says. The amount of trial and error could easily get boring, but you're given a clear list of different endings available for each of the characters, and you can jump in wherever you like once you finish a route, making full completion a pretty simple but enjoyable task. It's essentially a hyper-efficient visual novel which will have you growing attached to these very archetypal characters as you watch them meet various tragic fates. In spite of how dour you think the mood could be, the game has a fantastic sense of humour which motivates you to want to see the different ways the theatre will fuck around with these poor characters. Even though you're technically in full control, you'll always be kept guessing about where the game will go next throughout pretty much the whole run, but more importantly, do you think you can help them find a good ending, if that even exists? Even though Dishonored isn't the longest game out there by a mile, finally getting around to playing it for the first time, I couldn't help but respect just how much effort was put into the game's scale, and then seeing how this scale gives you options and then subsequently forces you to deal with the consequences. You're given most of the tools you can use pretty early on, and as you're presented with each level, you're given a wide selection of ways to progress, sub-objectives to complete or ignore, and moral choices to make. While I pretty much raw-dogged this first playthrough, just going with the flow while trying to make the best choices but not beating myself up if I mess up, I was shocked at just how much every mistake I made caught up with me. It didn't feel like I was being punished since I was just so impressed in how reactionary a decade-old game's world was. I have a friend who's been replaying Dishonored almost annually since she first played it, and after finishing it for the first time myself, I get why. While she humbly told me about how she can get through the entire game pretty much unspotted, with barely a drop of blood on her hands, I now get how impressive that is, but also appreciate how the game invites you to replay and keep learning the ins and outs of its world and get to that point. While I don't plan to get to that level of mastery anytime soon, I do want to continue on with the series and see how the next games can live up to the high bar set by the first. I remember Rhythm Thief being pretty well promoted by Nintendo around the era it released at the start of the 3DS's life, but since then I think it's faded into semi-obscurity. It's actually a little sad since I think this game's main legacy is a TikTok sound, because it's actually a pretty fantastic game otherwise. Rhythm Thief was developed by the same team behind Professor Layton, and this is very clear with the exploration around the streets of Paris, even complete with tapping around every screen to try and uncover secrets. But instead of a slew of puzzles and brain teasers to solve, Rhythm Thief, as the name suggests, is packed to the brim with different rhythm minigames. Most of these are fantastic, and unlike Professor Layton where 90% of the puzzles are completely unrelated to the story going on around it, pretty much every section of gameplay in Rhythm Thief is contextualized within the story and fit in pretty perfectly. It gets to balance the story and gameplay pretty spot on, with the story never taking too much attention away before you get to do something interactive, but still present enough that you're always progressing through the narrative. The narrative is a bit batshit, involving cults, thieving alter egos, and a potentially undead Napoleon causing mayhem in modern Paris. While it is certifiably off the wall, it's just cohesive enough that it all works. The only issue is that near the end it seems like they're trying to set up a sequel that unfortunately hasn't materialized yet. While I was having a great time for most of Rhythm Thief, there was one particular moment that made me almost drop it about halfway through. It's a simple enough minigame where you need to tap to match the beat of different flashing buttons, essentially mimicking a metronome, but the level of precision required and the level of precision the 3DS touchscreen is capable of processing are almost completely incompatible. This makes a mandatory minigame a torturous activity and mindless tapping until eventually the game thinks that you've done it right and lets you progress. In trying to find a trick to this minigame online, I found multiple reports of people just dropping the game at this point since they couldn't get it to work, which sucks since pretty much everything else works perfectly. Aside from that one moment in particular, Rhythm Thief is a fantastic game that I really hope gets a surprise sequel someday, since it's a great gameplay loop that hasn't been replicated since. And because the new Professor Layton revival is almost ready for release, it seems like this would be the best opportunity to continue the streak of reviving dormant series.
3, 2, 1, go!
While I don't think it's going down as one of the best games of all time, Marvel's Spider-Man is such a well-crafted, concise open-world game that I think deserves all the praise it got when it originally launched 6 years ago. I somehow managed to miss playing it myself, but seeing how much attention and praise surrounded the follow-up last year, I thought it would be worth actually starting the short series back where it began. The main source of my praise for Spider-Man is its scale. The map isn't too big, the story isn't too long, and you're given just enough to do around the city to keep you busy, but not overwhelmed. With open world games, especially in the 2010s, it really felt like every developer was trying to make the biggest, longest game possible, but Spider-Man feels so refreshing to get through because it clearly isn't competing in the dick measuring contest. There isn't much good I can say about Spider-Man that hasn't already been covered, since it's hardly an obscure game. I don't think that Miles or MJ's sections were too obtrusive, but I don't really think that's too controversial. But either way, since this game didn't drain me at all really, I'm looking forward to going through the rest of the series when I feel like I'm in the mood for it again. So after playing the Switch port of the original Katamari Damacy last year and really enjoying it, I naturally moved on and played the port of the sequel, We Love Katamari Reroll, and of course I enjoyed it because it's more of the same, it's more Katamari. There are some minor tweaks and extra modes, there's a little side story, but in essence it's more of the same game. With something as distinct as Katamari, that makes sense since you can only really change it so much before it becomes something else. I don't have much to say because I like the first Katamari, so I can't really fault the sequel for doing more of what I liked, but you know who didn't like that idea? Kate Attack Takahashi, the creator of Katamari Damacy. He wanted the first one to be an experimental one-off and didn't feel like there was need for a sequel, since he'd pretty much executed his vision with the first. But with the big demand and studio support after the success of the original, he relented. That's why it's called We Love Katamari. The game is aware and makes references to the success of the original, and this idea of the game existing as fan service is core to the game's plot. After the completion of We Love Katamari, Takahashi parted ways with the franchise, and I don't know if this affected the quality of the series going onwards since I haven't played any more of the titles, but hopefully more get ported in the coming years to make them more accessible. Even though he's mostly remained in the industry, Takahashi did have a brief stint working as a playground designer in Nottingham in 2009, but unfortunately the project was indefinitely delayed, so at least the children of Nottingham are safe from being caught by any giant Katamaris, but who knows how long that'll last. Another game that I got as part of a bundle was Later Alligator, and since it's so unassuming, I didn't really have many expectations, but upon actually playing it, I was pleasantly surprised at how it all came together. Pat, the incredibly paranoid alligator, is convinced that there's a conspiracy that someone in his family is out to kill him, so he hires a player to explore the city and meet up with the various members of his very extended family to work out who it might be. So it's up to you to manage your time as effectively as possible to go around the city, play each of the mini-games his massive collection of family members challenge you with, all in time for the surprise party that may or may not be organised for him in the evening. Since a single playthrough of the game doesn't take that long, it's a challenge to see just how many of the family you can get to meet and beat their challenge, all while occasionally going back to Pat to see how he's holding up. The presentation is fantastic with the desaturated colour palette mixed with the expressive animations breathing life into a city that could otherwise be a little bland. The combination of point and click, minigames and time management all work surprisingly well, and thanks to the endearing writing, you want to get to know as many of these family members as you can since they're all so entertaining. Later Alligator is a kind of game I can see myself returning to just see how well I can do with each run, and slowly perfecting the most efficient way to wrangle this massive family. Since you'll likely miss so much on your first run and probably fail some minigames as well, you can really get as much out of this game as you want. I don't think it'll be for everyone, but it's worth picking up if it sounds like your thing. Mouthwashing doesn't seem like the type of game that would go viral and quickly amass a pretty big fanbase. It's a 2-hour-long, low-poly psychological horror game, but somehow it caught on like wildfire, and it's maintained a consistent following since it came out in September. In spite of being such a short game, I think the reason why it's so conducive to online conversation is the non-linear storytelling and ambiguous narrative elements. The boundaries of reality and delusion are constantly being shifted, and since everything is being told out of order with two different protagonists, it's very easy for different players to have a very different interpretation and takeaway from the same story. Of course there are secrets and little details you can miss, but for the most part everyone who completes the game will play the same events in the same order. I played Mouthwashing in between a bunch of longer narrative focused games that had very little room for ambiguity, the kind of games where the story is stretched out and most people are going to learn the same lessons and have the same understanding. But Mouthwashing with a refreshing short change of pace that has stuck with me in the weeks since playing it. My only main complaint is that quite late on it decides that it wants to be a bit more of a game. For the first 90% you can take the narrative and gameplay at your own pace, and even though there's some tension, it's essentially a walking sim with some light puzzle elements. But then there are a few short sections very late on that all of a sudden are a lot more interactive and timing focused, and while that usually wouldn't be an issue, it doesn't feel cohesive with the rest of the game. But maybe that was the intention, and these sections are meant to immerse you into the horror by literally feeling uncomfortable to play after the rest of the game lulls you into a false sense of security. Even so, it was less immersive discomfort and more just frustrating. But these moments are short and easy to breeze past even if you get snagged on them a little. As a whole package though, I think everyone should play Mouthwashing, at least if they have the stomach for it. I've always been passively interested in the Yakuza series, liking the idea of a more contained open world and the contrast of a serious main narrative paired with the stupidest selection of side quests and minigames imaginable. But with how extensive the series is, it was never something I was in the mood to dive into. However, a combination of making a friend who's a massive fan of the series and was raving about how much fun she was having playing Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, and also seeing the first 7 games bundled together on a criminally low sale, I couldn't really resist anymore. I started with a remake of the original Yakuza Kiwami as opposed to the prequel Yakuza 0, since I want to be a bit more attached to the cast before seeing their origins laid out, and I think that was the right choice. I got pretty much exactly what I signed up for. The open world is tiny compared to some others, but it's easy to learn and packed with enough activities to keep you entertained, and while I thought the main story would be a bit too self-serious for my tastes, thanks to the wildly varying tone switching constantly throughout the game, it was actually quite satisfying to follow the core story throughout it all. While I'm aware that I could have stretched the length of the game tenfold if I wanted to complete every objective possible, I actually preferred having the freedom to dip in and out of the side content to diversify the playthrough without committing to seeing absolutely everything. And that way I can get quite a bit out of a replay if I'm still in the mood after catching up with the rest of the series. The only real issue I had is that the combat didn't entirely click with me. There were some moments where I was like, yes, I finally get how this works, and then I'd go to a more challenging fight and immediately backpedal and realise I don't know shit. I prefer the fights where they are more open-ended and chaotic, letting you really have fun with the environments, but when they are more contained, I ended up getting more frustrated. But hearing how the combat doesn't remain consistent throughout the whole main series is nice to know, since I'm not particularly attached to this style after beating Kiwami. Even so, I'm happy that I've finally begun Yakuza, and I'm looking forward to seeing how I get on with the rest of the series after this. I fear that any other year, Bow Path of the Teal Lotus would have made a lot more noise, but releasing only 2 months after the surprisingly successful 9 Souls, which both has a very similar look and gameplay style, it unfortunately meant that Bow ended up being the shadow of another game pretty much as soon as it launched. I haven't actually played 9 Souls mainly because I didn't want to play it so soon after Bow, not wanting to have the constant comparison in my head while I'm playing it. So what I can say in isolation after just playing Bow is that I had a good time with it. I have a predisposition towards Metroidvanias, so unless they really fuck up, I'm usually going to enjoy them, and since Bow isn't a fuck up, surprise surprise, I had fun. The main takeaway to know before going into Bow is that there's much more of a focus on the platforming than the combat. I've seen some people saying that the platforming is much more challenging than the combat, but maybe I'm just better at platforming and worse at combat than the average person, but I found the balance pretty fine. The environments all look great, and while exploring them is a lot of fun, you don't get much of that satisfying Metroidvania looping back on yourself, since each of the biomes tend to be more self-contained. You will need to backtrack to get new abilities to proceed in typical Metroidvania fashion, but the whole experience is just a bit more linear. I don't really have much of a problem with this level of linearity, since it's nice to have a Metroidvania that just lets you relax a bit more. But what you won't find relaxing is the final boss. I'm not going to spoil too much, since it's of course the last thing that you'll do in this game, but I wasn't surprised after beating it that some people called it an unfair difficulty spike and had given up on the game after attempting it. Not me though, I persisted, and beating it was all the more satisfying for it, even if every one of its 6 phases felt like it was scraping years off my life. Aside from that though, it's a cute Metroidvania that would actually work as a good introduction to the genre, but maybe strap in for that final boss the closer you get to it. Not to lump together games in the same genre, but Ori and the Will of the Wisps just managed to beat up Bow. Because I played it so much earlier in the year, all the way back in January compared to Bow in August, I didn't want to let a bit of recency bias push me to favour the game I played more recently above something that I have a slightly more foggy memory of. My main memory of the second Ori game is that I had a good time, and it was a successful follow-up to the game that came before it, which I played a couple of years ago. However, even though it's been a while since I played the original, it still feels like quite a recent memory, and that's made my memories of both that and the sequel kind of meld together a little. While there are plenty of unique mechanics and areas added in the second to make it stand out and an overall more expansive game, it shares the same distinct and undeniably stunning glowy style of the original, and that just makes them a bit harder to define when you add the passage of time to the mix. Even so, thanks to the fantastic designs and refined but not too complex combat, I still had a great time getting through this, and because I love this genre, Ori being a pretty cookie cutter Metroidvania doesn't really bother me since it's done with so much polish. I don't think Ori will ever be my favourite Metroidvania either, but it doesn't have to be the best for me to appreciate what it does well. I don't know where I got the idea that Death's Door is a roguelike, but I stuck with that misinformation until I started and quite quickly realised that that isn't the case, and it's a 2D adventure game with a focus on action and dungeon crawling, or in layman's terms, a Zelda clone. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but what is slightly problematic is that the game then becomes very easy to compare with one of my favourite games I played last year, Tunic. So while I was quickly getting to terms with Death's Door being nothing like what I expected it to be, I was also dealing with a pretty high bar of how much I enjoyed Tunic about a year before looming over it. I'm not the first one to make this comparison either, and unfortunately the consensus is that Death's Door always comes out with silver, and as much as I love to be a contrarian, I'm no different here. Which sucks, because without the comparison it's pretty easy to love what Death's Door has going on. Unlike more classic 2D Zelda games, the progression is pretty smooth, and there's not much stopping you from just constantly moving forwards, and on top of that it's got a great balance of linearity in each of the areas, while then having some choice to tackle each of these areas in whichever order you'd like. There are also some pretty entertaining boss fights sprinkled in, and the endgame has a good sense of spectacle as well as challenge without feeling like too much of a spike. So while no, I didn't enjoy it more than Tunic, I did enjoy it, and I need to slap myself every time I find myself constantly pitting two bad bitches against each other. Sure, one is badder, as in better, but Death's Door is still a cute adventure that's a satisfying journey to work through. The prospect of a horror fishing game is of course enticing, so as soon as I heard about Dredge I knew it was the kind of thing I'd want to play, and on that front it does deliver, well, initially. Instead of relying on jump scares, it's more about the subtle fear that builds up as you dare to spend later and later nights out in the terror-infested waters to make as much money as possible. However, that dread isn't built up throughout the game, instead it's probably at its scariest at the beginning, when you're less comfortable with the gameplay loop, when there's more mystery about what's to come, it'll keep you pretty tense, but unfortunately that feeling does gradually decline as you get further in. At the start it's definitely that horror fishing game you're promised, but it slowly turns into a fishing time management game with some stressful circumstances thrown in. There's still a good amount of variety and the world is full of interesting characters that you'll want to learn about, but at best it's just a bit unnerving. Even so, slightly drifting from its initial genre promises isn't an unforgivable crime, and I still had plenty of fun working through it. I was having just as much fun when I was terrified and inexperienced at the start as I was in the second half when I was locked in and flying through the game making bank off my fish and getting the most out of every in-game second and every in-game day. Just a different kind of fun. Persona 3 Reload is the only version of Persona 3 out of the now 4 available that I've finished, but even I know that it isn't the best way to play through that story. But why? The Persona series isn't new to ports, remasters, or definitive editions, but it is new to remakes. This is the franchise's first attempts at remaking one of its main entries, and it comes almost 20 years after the original. I wasn't in the boardroom at Atlas, so I don't know what exactly was going on when the idea for Reload was being pitched, but it does seem like there was a bit of an active effort to Persona 5-ify Persona 3. Especially with the battle system, every quality of life and modern refinement made to Persona since the original version of 3 has been added, and even special ultra moves are added to really show off the game's new look. Unfortunately, that overcorrected the unrefined gameplay of the original by making it way too easy. I can't remember one instance in 3 where I was genuinely struggling with a boss. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I like Persona 3 Reload. Persona is a great series and this is more of it, so I can only complain so much, but it does feel like a lot of the spice in the original was dulled down in modernizing it. The new game looks good and the UI is of course amazing, but it's gotten rid of quite a lot of that mid-2000s grunge that defines the original and literally cleaned it up. It makes the tone of the game feel a little lighter, and I think that does a disservice to the overall narrative by making it feel a little less impactful. I like these characters and I like the story overall, but I just didn't get as invested as I thought I would, since my expectations were a little too high going in. I did enjoy the party members in isolation, but I do wish we got a chance to see them spend more time with each other. However, the group of non-party member social links is perhaps the strongest batch compared to the ones available in Persona 4 and 5, with my personal favourite being Bebe, the Temperance Arcana. On the topic of characters, one of the main strengths of Reload is the addition made to Ryoji's character and arc, and is part of the reason why I think the story highlights for me were the moments he was involved in. While I enjoyed Reload quite a lot in the grand scheme, I couldn't help but think there were some misguided decisions made in the whole process. I understand that the answer was taken out to ensure it was properly refined, but adding it on as DLC felt a little cheap, and the fact that Kotone and Portable were seemingly completely forgotten feels like a waste too. I can't imagine it's easy remaking a game as beloved and with such rabid fans as Persona 3, so I do want to give Atlas some grace, since overall it was a good time and it did inspire me to start working on my Persona series of videos, so maybe I should give it more credit. Also, plenty of mistakes can be forgiven since Reload does have the best opening of any version of Persona 3, and you can quote me on that. I've always loved the idea of parkour movement shooter games, but never really taken the dive, but the vaporwavy aesthetic of neon white paired with the clips I'd seen of the game was enough to sell me on it. One thing to get out of the way is that this game's story is pretty awful. At the start you think it might have legs and be a little intriguing, but as you go on you realise it's just not the best. But that doesn't really matter since the story doesn't really impact the rest of the game at all, and unlike its shaky narrative, the gameplay is solid. Each level is crafted to have an optimal route to reach the best time possible, and almost all of them have secrets to uncover amongst the scenery as well. The different selection of guns are tied to different traversal abilities, and working out how to use your ammo and finite abilities to reach the end of the level often ends up feeling like a puzzle in itself. As my first foray into the subgenre of action games, I was thoroughly impressed by Neon White, and even though by the end I didn't care much about what was going on in the story, that didn't bother me since everything else was so enjoyable. In spite of the core gameplay hook of Dave the Diver being pretty simple, daytime deep sea fishing, nighttime selling the fish at your sushi bar, it took me a while to actually get Dave the Diver. My preconception is that the fishing was quite open-ended, and it was all going to be about managing the restaurant and maximising profits. Playing with this in mind, I wasn't really having that much fun with the first few in-game days of Dave the Diver. However, once I realised that the core campaign and story missions are what held the meat of the story, and instead focused on these while treating the restaurant as a side objective, I started having a lot more fun. The core gameplay loop of fishing and selling is enjoyable, but it's a lot easier to stomach alongside the story missions that will give the days you spend fishing a lot more purpose and structure, and by focusing on these missions you'll quickly unlock tools and upgrades that make the fishing and the restaurant sim a lot deeper and consequently more fun. You'll regularly run into bosses which are a highlight of the underwater exploration, and by completing missions for the likeable cast of characters, the small world of Dave the Diver starts to feel lived in. By the time I'd reached the end of the main story, the adventure I'd had to get there was a lot more varied and had gone in a lot more unexpected directions than I would have expected after this first couple of hours of gameplay, where I was honestly considering dropping it. There's probably a platitude about persistence and changing your approach hidden in there somewhere, but I think you get what I'm going for. I struggle to grasp how popular No More Heroes is. It was successful enough on the Wii to get a sequel, but was then kind of forgotten for a generation, but it had maintained enough of that following to be revived with a spin-off and another sequel more recently. In spite of that, I've never really seen anyone talk about it, and I don't really know how much of an active fanbase it has, but I've always been aware of the strange series, and this was a year that I'd finally bite the bullet and actually play it. A challenging boss rush game, and the Wii's motion controls hardly seem like a match made in heaven, and since the game is nearing its 18th birthday, I could definitely feel its age in some of the more imprecise moments. But for the most part it held together well enough that I wasn't consistently getting frustrated with the game's unconventional input method. In fact, I was more distracted by this game's dedication to keeping you guessing, breaking the fourth wall, all encapsulated in a high saturation cel-shaded style that makes a Wii game still look pretty fresh. While the League of Assassins that make up the selection of bosses aren't created equal, with some having strange design choices that made them more frustrating than challenging, as a whole they were a fun lineup to work through. Of course, just beating the bosses isn't the whole game, and you'll need to complete a selection of lower bounties and mini-game chores to earn enough cash to take on the next main target. It's a fun gimmick though, and it helps contribute to the game's overall sense of humour, and while it got grating at times, it helped flesh out the setting and make this unbelievable world feel at least a little more real. When talking about ambitious games that I end up not agreeing with, I mention how I always prefer a big swing and a miss compared to something safe and bland. And while No More Heroes is a big swing, it's also a pretty strong hit as well, since even though it didn't succeed on every front, it succeeded in the areas that mattered, and I can see how this first game helped launch the unconventional series it has ended up being a part of. I've technically been playing Twilight Princess for about 10 years, so I'm happy that 2024 was the year I finally got to see the credits. I first picked it up on the Wii in 2014-ish, got about halfway through, then dropped it around Snow Peak Ruins. Then a few years later, in about 2018, I picked up the HD remaster for the Wii U, luckily during its price dip before it reached the extortionate price it is now. Then I played it for a short while, then dropped it again. Then last year I thought, this is it, I'm finally finishing it this year. Played it for a while, then dropped it at, you guessed it, Snow Peak Ruins. But this year I didn't want to leave that save file to rot and picked it back up and finally pushed through to finish this game's pretty great third act. As a self-proclaimed Zelda fan, I'm pretty ashamed it took me that long to actually finish it, especially since I think it's probably the best part of the game. I think the reason why I kept dropping it around Snow Peak Temple is that the first half of the game really plods along. The pacing is almost aggressively slow and getting around the world seems pretty inefficient, but the second half of the game opens up a lot more, and while it's by no means the best incarnation of Hyrule, you can have a bit more fun with it in this part of the game. Also, the game doesn't hold you back much with not much of a dictated pace for the last third especially. The last handful of dungeons are a lot of fun and a great set of puzzles, and you can pretty much do them all back to back with only a few overworld prerequisites in between. It also helps that this is when the sword players are most fleshed out and you have the most items to play with, even if some of them aren't used that much outside their dungeons. And then you get to the finale and that confrontation with Ganondorf is iconic for a reason, and it really felt monumental to finally get to play it myself after I've been building up to it for years. While Twilight Princess isn't the best Zelda game, it really got me missing a more classic feeling 3D Zelda, since while I loved Breath of the Wild when it came out, after waiting so long for Tears of the Kingdom, only for it to be a little disappointing, I'm just really hoping that when Nintendo finally return to 3D Zelda, we get something a bit more reminiscent of what Twilight Princess does well, which is fantastic atmospheric dungeons and a more linear story that's easier to get invested in. But what do I know, it took me a decade to finish. When it was announced, I immediately paid attention to Thank Goodness You're Here after hearing it was being developed by the same team as Untitled Goose Game, since even though that game isn't one of my all-time favourites, it was a fun idea and I was excited to see where the team would go next. As it turns out, I was mishearing things, and the games just share a publisher and are actually made by completely different teams, and the first main indicator of that is just how far Thank Goodness You're Here was willing to push its jokes. While the sense of humour in Untitled Goose Game is quaint and mischievous, Thank Goodness You're Here is more in the realm of crude absurdity, all centred around a fictionalised town in Yorkshire that leans heavily into the, well, Yorkshire of it all. It shouldn't work as well as it does, and comedy in games isn't something that's easy to achieve, especially since it's very much a focus of this game, but the heavily stylised cartoonish style and abstract sense of scale, combined with the perfectly paced cutscenes, meant that every joke felt expertly measured to make you laugh, or at least smile. Only being 2 hours long, Thank Goodness You're Here is well worth the time you put in, especially if you love exploring densely packed surreal northern towns, or being greeted by some of the most creative innuendos you can imagine. When discussing accessibility in games, the focus is nearly always on making it so games are as approachable as possible to those of the conditions that would make traditional methods of play more challenging. Of course that's important and well worth appreciating, but then there's the other side of accessibility that gets a little less attention, focused on making games that are easier to enjoy to people who are bad at them. I've always struggled with fighting games. Most other genres I've managed to get to grips with over time and repeated exposure, but as much as I wanted to love them, I've never been able to get to grips with combos in the ways that most fighting games need me to. I've always appreciated Street Fighter from a distance, and I even played a bit of the port for 4 on the 3DS, but 6 feels like the franchise's first proper attempt at making its gameplay idiot-proof, and not to be overly self-deprecating, but my enjoyment is proof of that. The simple input option in 6 still retains enough depth that it doesn't feel completely brainless to use, but strays far enough from the traditional combo inputs that amateurs such as myself can have a good time. The other aspect of Street Fighter 6 that also attracted me was how much content was being offered. I've noticed that fighting game story modes tend to not take much of the focus from other titles I've tried, and as someone who's usually looking for a strong single player experience, that's always a little disappointing, since just battles after battles in arcade mode can get a little tiresome. That's why the semi-open world of Street Fighter 6's story mode, with a detailed character creator and the ability to seamlessly enter matches from the overworld, was so appealing. The style of gameplay and exploration in the story wasn't like anything I'd ever experienced, and using classic Street Fighter moves for exploration and platforming never really got old. While character creators in fighting games don't usually mix, it was a lot of fun using abilities learned from the main characters to Frankenstein together a moveset for my character that was fun to adapt and build as I progressed. I do wish that more of the core cast of Street Fighter characters got a bit more involved in the main story mode, since it did feel a bit strange that they were just showing up but never really seemed that interested in the world-altering events that were taking place. Even so, since each of them has a bit of story in their arcade mode, I can only really complain so much. Either way, I was really happy that Street Fighter 6 is malleable enough that a newcomer was able to get so much fun and so much time out of it, and I definitely plan to return when there's been a few more updates. Continuing on from where I left the Professor and Luke last year at the end of Curious Village, I was happy to see that Pandora's Box maintained and even slightly improved upon the formula that was set up in the original. Since I never played the series when it was originally being released, I can always appreciate when a generations old game like this holds up so well to a new audience without any nostalgia goggles. While the signs of age and the clear technical limitation of Layton's second adventure are clear, none of these hamper the enjoyment at all and just add to the charm of the overall package. The art style has aged fantastically, and I appreciate how the scale for the sequel has expanded with a more varied group of settings, making the story of Pandora's Box feel a bit more grand and high stakes. The main reason I was hesitant to start playing the series at all was because of how I'm not usually great at brain teasers, but maybe I'm just learning after completing the first one, but it feels like I didn't struggle as much with the puzzles here. They were still challenging, but I think hint coins were usually enough compared to how often I would have to give up and look for answers online with the first one. Shameful cheating aside, the narrative of Pandora's Box was just a bit more convoluted compared to Curious Village, and the twists felt a little less rewarding in the end. But even so, it wasn't bad by any stretch, and the campy storytelling paired with the occasional animated cutscenes all made it come together in a way that was engaging to follow, even if it required plenty of suspended disbelief. I'm just happy that my momentum for the series is being maintained, and I'm looking forward to when the stories start to feel a bit less episodic and perhaps develop the recurring characters a bit more, but from what I've heard that will come with the later entries. Either way, I'll find out next year. Dungeons of Hinterberg is a pretty unassuming game, and while I thought there was a good chance that I'd click with it, I was still surprised at how much I ended up enjoying it. The game has you going on an extended break from the monotony of work life in Hinterberg, a town that through some supernatural occurrences has spurted out 25 dungeons which allow those inside them to use magic in an attempt to complete them. You're on a Persona-esque calendar system, and you can choose every day to manage your time between visiting the dungeons and socializing with the locals to boost various stats and unlock buffs. My main issue with dungeon crawlers is that they can often feel quite draining with just how long some of the dungeons can be, but in Hinterberg each of the dungeons are quite short, taking about 20 minutes to beat maximum. Because of these short bursts of variety, they never really get boring, and it always feels like you're getting a new opportunity to experiment with the magical abilities at your disposal. Each of the dungeons balances combat and puzzle solving, and while some people complain that the combat was a bit basic, I think it had just enough depth to match the game's length, and also gives you quite a bit of opportunity for customization as well. You don't just select the game's dungeons from a menu either. From the hub town you can fast travel to one of the 4 main open areas, where you need to come across each of the dungeons by scouring each of the expansive zones, sometimes you need to complete side quests, or a prerequisite number of other dungeons to gain access to all of them. This, balanced with the social sim aspect of the game, which isn't super deep but will have you getting attached to a good selection of the inhabitants of Hinterberg, results in a quite satisfying final package. I think Dungeons of Hinterberg unfortunately flew under the radar a little, but if you want something like a condensed Zelda Persona hybrid, then this is probably the perfect game for you. After completing the first half of the Great Ace Attorney duology last year, I was excited to see how the story threads that were introduced would all end up tying together, and luckily I wasn't disappointed. In fact, I think Resolve surpasses the first half of Great Ace Attorney, since it doesn't need to worry about introducing you to the mechanics or characters, and you can just jump right in. Because of that, I would also heavily dissuade this from being anyone's starting point in the series, but with how both games are almost exclusively bundled together, I doubt anyone's going to be attempting that anyway. I can't say much for fear of spoilers, but it felt like the perfect progression from the first half, expertly building on the foundations that were set up for it. With only 2 games worth of time to work with, all of the core cast are properly developed and had satisfying endings, and while some twists weren't that well hidden, the narrative payoff was still enjoyable to watch. I didn't expect Resolve to fix my main issue with the original being the pacing, and it wasn't. Some cases still felt like they were dragging on and were a bit too convoluted, but this time I didn't care as much since A, I was more accustomed to it by this point, and B, I was just more invested in the story that some awkward pacing was a little easier to deal with since I cared more about what was happening. I still think it's going to be a little strange going from Great Ace Attorney back to the start of the original trilogy, since even though that's a chronological order I was going for, since the trilogy is so much older, it might be a crunchy transition. Even so, seeing how much people enjoy the main trilogy, I think that hype will carry me through, and I'm excited to see how that narrative starts next year. Out of the 6 Game of the Year nominees, which at the time of recording hasn't happened yet but almost definitely will have by the time this is posted, I've played 4 of them this year. I unfortunately skimmed over Balatro, even though it's definitely the kind of thing I'd enjoy, and I haven't even got around to playing Elden Ring yet, so I'm pretty far off from considering Shadow of the Erdtree, but I played all the others. While Black Myth Wukong didn't reach the same level of critical acclaim as the other 3 I've played, nor did it beat out any of them in my own ranking, I can still understand why it's such a big deal. Even if you don't consider its place as the first real AAA Chinese game, it's also just a high-octane, spectacle-filled, polished action game that does just command attention. While a few of the areas did feel a little repetitive, for the most part the world looked amazing, with plenty of variety throughout each of its 6 chapters. One of the main critiques for Wukong was the prevalence of invisible walls, and not to say that I know more than seasoned game critics, but this really wasn't much of an issue for me. Maybe it's just a sixth sense, or just looking at the logic of the map design, but it was always pretty clear where you can and can't go, and I was very rarely finding myself up against an invisible barrier without expecting it. And because the world was so stunning, it was easy to overlook minor gripes like this, since what you can explore is sprawling and well designed. It's just an overall really strong game. The comically large selection of bosses, while some clearly had a lot more effort put in than others, meant that there was always something new to fight, and the high level of customizability with spirit attacks, armor, weapons, the skill tree, spells, potions, and I'm sure there's even more that I'm forgetting, meant that if you are struggling with any challenges, there's always something you can go back and tweak to improve your chances. Even the side quests were often just as rewarding as the main story, never feeling that arbitrary, instead further highlighting the depth of the world created. Working with the source material as well established and full of lore to learn from as Journey to the West is a genius move, not only to pay homage to the game's Chinese origins, but just as a great way to make the world feel a bit more genuine and deep. I don't have much of a reference point for the 16th century novel except what I picked up from playing this, but I do kind of love the idea that this game is essentially a fanfiction sequel to it. It's not really an issue with the game itself, but it's become a pet peeve of mine when people call Black Myth Wukong a Souls-like, since it really isn't. There's clear inspiration for the subgenre in some of the combat mechanics and exploration, but that doesn't make it a Souls-like, it's just a challenging action RPG. Minor bitch session aside, I had a great time with it, and even if it doesn't match the heights of the other Game of the Year contenders, that doesn't really matter since it's still a good game, just not the best ever. It does feel sacrilegious to put a yaoi visual novel above games like Street Fighter and Black Myth Wukong, but don't get it twisted, Dramatical Murder isn't any yaoi visual novel, it's the yaoi visual novel. We follow yaoi Jesus Alba as his pretty standard life in the cyberpunk style city island Midorojima is turned upside down through the various events that take place during the game's 5 main romance routes. With each of the love interests, he'll explore more of the city, uncover its secrets, have a shag or two, and maybe just fall in love. or maybe just another shack. I've been aware of Dramatical Murder for years, but it was only made easily accessible on Steam semi-recently, and even though certain scenes from this release are heavily censored, there are some pretty simple ways to mod around this, but I wouldn't know, that's just what I've heard. For a game that took so long to get an official localization, I'm surprised at just how good the writing is, and even though there isn't an English dub, the Japanese voice acting is so well done that it isn't really necessary. Even though it's technically a dating sim, there's actually a massive focus on the overarching story, and the fact that so much effort is put into world building really makes this game's unbelievable world feel relatively immersive. It's hard to say too much specific about Dramatical Murder, partially because I don't want to give too many spoilers, but also because I went into a yaoi trance and played it all in one day off, so it did blur together a little. Even so, strong recommendation if you have a lock on your door. Oxenfree has been gathering digital dust on my Switch since it first went on a 75% off sale back in 2017, and even though I'd heard almost exclusively positive things, it just never really felt like I was in the mood for it. Maybe leaving it for so long tricked me into having low expectations, because when I did end up trying it, I had a fantastic time and I was thoroughly surprised. It starts off undeniably slow, but what quickly impressed me is that even though it has such a stylized look and you're watching from such a zoomed out perspective, I was completely immersed thanks to a strong atmosphere that was gradually established, growing more and more tense until you're rushing to see the conclusion so you can finally unclench. A lot of the characters feel unlikable, and I have to assume that's by design, and even though they don't always make the best decisions, thanks to how well written they are, they feel human and believable, and since it's a relatively short adventure, the grating nature of some characters doesn't get too bad, and instead it just further submerges you in the game's palpable tension. Even though the story is on a pretty set course, there are important decisions and enough interactive elements to make it feel like enough of a game to keep you engaged and invested. I wouldn't think that Oxenfree would be able to perfect what it's going for so effectively looking at it, but everything just slots together so well. The slow start is tricky, and if you're less patient, then the first hour or so of gameplay might tempt you to drop it. However, once you're in deep enough, you'll struggle to tear yourself away until it's over. I'd seen quite a few clips of people playing Slime Rancher, but I never really got it, and because of that I was only ever passively interested, but after finding it for a good price, I thought I should give it a try. While I'm sure some people could find interest in watching the right person play through Slime Rancher, to me it's a kind of game that you need to get your hands on to fully understand. I've already mentioned a couple of times that I'm not the biggest fan of first person games, and paired with my general wariness about how exactly Slime Rancher works, I'd really set up a pretty sizable bias against it, but after having my hands on it for an hour or so, it all clicked and the gameplay cycle had me hooked. There is such an oversaturation of farming games right now, but Slime Rancher is such a refreshing execution, taking a more direct and tactile approach to building up your farm as slimy friends, that it's easy to lose hours to just another day, oh I'll just do one more side quest, that I had no trouble breezing through the story of Slime Rancher. That story is quite hands off, but it provides enough structure without pushing you in a certain direction that you can alternate between turning your brain off for a few in-game days and relaxing, or locking in and optimizing your whole setup without too much trouble. Something which can bum me out about games sometimes if I think about it is that I might have an almost identical journey for a game as most other players, but with how many tools are drip fed throughout Slime Rancher, it's so easy to carve your own path through the challenges that are put in your way. Even though I put Slime Rancher down pretty soon after finishing the main story, I can easily understand how people treat this as a game that they can come back to indefinitely. While I don't think I'm that committed, it does leave me excited to move on to the sequel after its full release when I want another hit of the same addictive cycle. Sega don't make it particularly easy to play Space Channel 5 in order. While the sequel is readily available on a variety of different platforms, the first is only available in its original release format from back on the Dreamcast or PS2. So even though I've been meaning to play this series for ages, I ended up playing it completely out of order, playing the second first, then moving on to its most recent VR entry second, and I've only now got the first entry, which I'm going to end up playing last. That's a very long context for me to say that I started with Space Channel 5 Part 2, but being slightly out of order did nothing to stop the series from making a fantastic first impression. Ulala's dancing newscasting marathons are so flamboyant, over the top, and just generally unserious that there's really nothing else you can compare it to. In spite of its high concept, the gameplay contrasts it by being so hilariously simple. All you really do is copy the commands given to you by the enemies on beat to defeat them, but it's pulled and stretched in so many different directions that you're always kept on your toes. The story is obviously absurd, but the presentation has aged so well and doesn't really feel dated since the stylized graphics and overall aesthetic was already kind of exaggerated and outdated take on retro future that wasn't even trendy when it came out, but that made it timeless as a result. If you resonated with Ulala in 2002, then you'll resonate with her in 2024 and probably still will another 22 years in the future as well. Also worth mentioning is probably the best sign of the game's age, since Michael Jackson loved the first game so much. Thanks to his cultural pull at the time, he was was able to voice act a character called Space Michael. This isn't just a cameo either, Space Michael is genuinely part of the main cast for the rest of the game after he's introduced, and that's something no other game can claim. In conclusion, justice for Space Channel 5, a new entry soon please Sega. Animal World quite easily takes the crown as my favourite Metroidvania of the year, and while I played a good few others compared to the one or two I usually play a year, there wasn't really any doubt that Animal World was taking it for me. Not every game has to reinvent the wheel and subvert genre expectations, but Animal World did it so well that I can't help but look back on it fondly. Whether it's the occasionally violent approach the game takes to avoiding combat, the whimsy of collecting various toys as new abilities, paired with the unconventional ways that you use them. And that all contrasts the oppressive atmosphere of just about everything else, making sure that Animal World has a unique and enticing vibe that I don't think can be easily replicated. It didn't hook me immediately, and there are a couple of moments early on that I even thought of cutting my losses early, especially with how much time I wasted on Ultros. But luckily I persisted, and it quickly leaned into my favourite parts of a well-designed Metroidvania, with the pace gradually picking up until you get to the last hour of the game and you're doing everything hyper efficiently and you know the map and mechanics like the back of your hand. Animal World never gets easy, but you do get more comfortable as you piece together the different sections of its varied map. While the ending was quite abrupt, since the journey getting there was so satisfying, and since there's so much left to collect and explore if I want, I can't really complain. It's even more impressive learning that the game was mainly made by one person, since it feels so fully realised. I'm looking forward to seeing what he does next, but if it's anywhere near as good as Animal World, then I'm happy to wait. Even though I somehow survived the last console generation being a Wii U truther, I always subconsciously knew Sony was second place to me since Microsoft never really presented enough exclusives for me to want an Xbox. However, I remember vividly being interested in the Xbox One exclusive Sunset Overdrive back when it originally came out, but of course staved off any desire knowing that it wouldn't be that accessible to me. But in a genius business move, almost every Microsoft exclusive is now available on PC, so this year was my chance to finally get my hands on Sunset Overdrive. First impressions, the character creator lets you give your character a pompadour, so that's immediate points, and everything from then onwards lived up to that strong start. If there's one word to describe Sunset Overdrive, it's bouncy. From the start, the importance and fluidity of the game's movement is emphasised, and I wasn't surprised at all to find out that the same team went on to work on Marvel's Spider-Man a few years later, since just getting around in this game is just as much fun, if not more fun than it is there. What I really think pushes it above Spider-Man is how there weren't any restrictions put on the style and aesthetics since this is an original project. The apocalyptic city was bright and made exploring every corner consistently refreshing, and while the characters you meet on your journey are a little tropey and over the top, it matched the style of the game perfectly, so it works. For a game that puts you in such dire circumstances, the fun and gamification of this horrifying mutant apocalypse is always emphasised and makes Sunset Overdrive something that you'll never resist going back to. Some missions were duds, and it's not always worth going back to unlock every weapon and level them all up, but as a whole it was a surprisingly strong package that has stood the test of time well. It doesn't look like a game that's a decade old now, but one of the best aspects of its age is how cheap you can find it. On a Steam sale, you'll regularly find it selling for criminally low, so if you're even slightly tempted, it's some of the best gaming value you can get. I think I always knew that I'd enjoy Chia, with the fun of the possession mechanic and exploration being palpable from just watching trailers, but watching footage and getting your hands on it is something completely different, and the pure satisfaction of getting around the beautifully crafted condensed island of Chia needs to be played to be believed. The effort that went into crafting the world of Chia is the foundation the game is built off, and it made so much sense seeing a brief explanation of research that was done into making the setting, based on New Caledonia and Kanak culture, feel genuine. I don't think every game has to take the care to base its world on a real area and culture, however, the effort made by Chia does make it stand out and just feel a bit more unique and, like I already said, genuine. Even with such a fantastic setting and some heartfelt storytelling mixed in too, the glue that ties it all together is the aforementioned possession mechanic that makes traversal feel so fluid. You don't just select a target to possess and then become it, you build up momentum, and the force of jumping in and out of different objects and creatures makes it feel all the more impactful and satisfying. While you always have a goal to work towards, you can easily just keep yourself busy by exploring and finding every possession target and seeing which you have the most fun getting around with. Thanks to the limited scale of Chia, you won't get anywhere near bored as you play through it, since the main story isn't actually that long, so you're given permission to pace yourself with as many side objectives to make the adventure as long or short as you'd like it to be. Even if I rushed through the main story, I would have had a good time, but I love that the game respected me enough to take as much time as I wanted with a selection of activities to pick and choose from to keep me busy between each main mission. As I left it, there's still plenty more I can do in my Chia save, but even so, I had a pretty complete and satisfying adventure to reach credits by selecting the side content I was drawn to in the moment. Having all that extra content left to find while possessing innocent wildlife or sailing around leaves Chia an exciting prospect to return to whenever I find myself wanting a change of pace. After playing Earthbound for the first time last year, I initially planned to try and get my hands on a fan translation of Mother 3, but in the end that craving was satiated by something similar but also quite different. Omori is one of the many RPGs to take inspiration from Earthbound, but it takes a unique enough approach that it manages to not be defined by what it's lending from. In saying that, I think Omori fixes one of the main issues I had with Earthbound, and that's giving more attention to the characters. While the surreal world building and unique turn-based combat are both strong, the core cast of characters and unfurling the mysteries of their circumstances and complex relationships with each other is what drove me to keep going. By diving into themes of mental health deeper than the surface level, Omori creates a strong atmosphere, but it doesn't become monotonous or weighed down by its subject matter. Omori has a great sense of humour, and even with its simple pixel art style, the map is split into unique areas that all stick out from each other and were fun to explore, and then this was being paired with a charming hand-drawn style of the battles meant that the game was constantly visually stimulating, and because of this distinct style, it also meant that the darker moments stood out more and cut deeper because of how much they contrasted the rest of the game. It was great to play a clearly retro-inspired game that takes full advantage of more modern trends and storytelling styles to create something unique and memorable. Sable is another game that I've neglected in my Steam library for far too long, which feels a bit strange since the prospect of a highly stylized open world game without any combat is of course intriguing. So after it was left unplayed for so long, I'm happy to report that it lived up to its unique selling point and ended up over-delivering. It's easy to have your brain combat rotted over time when playing games, since such a recurring element in almost every game is some form of hostile aggression. Fighting is just in the blood of the medium and most of its genres, and open world games usually slot into that neatly. The way Sable substitutes what is usually such a big part of the genre is to instead lean heavily into exploring the world but also meeting its people. A lot of games are described as coming of age stories, but usually this is just a set part of the narrative, but Sable goes out of its way to gamify the process of coming of age. After a brief tutorial where you get accustomed to the controls, you set free to explore the pretty expansive world, given a little bit of a hint of a good starting point, but otherwise given free reign. But there is a goal, and that's working out what to do with your life. Well, Sable's life. As you explore, you'll meet different people from all walks of life and different professions. By helping them out, there's a chance that you might unlock a pin, and when you collect 3 of these matching pins from the same profession, you unlock the mask for it. These lifestyle marks are more than just a cosmetic, and they're actually how you finish the game. You only need 1 before you can return to your hometown and quickly finish your journey, but there's a high likelihood that you don't want to commit Sable to the first profession that offers her a mask, but instead try and get a taste for as much as you can. Getting some masks like the Entertainer or the Guard are linked to quest lines that will take you all around the map, but others are a little simpler. Like for the Merchant, you can buy 1 pin from every merchant you find, or for a Cartographer, you'll need to find as many of them throughout the varied landscape as possible. But while this sounds simple, it requires getting involved with these lifestyles in subtle ways, like finding cartographers will require keen observation and understanding the game's map, and you'll need to be thrifty with your buying and selling to be able to afford the merchant pins. The amount of pins and masks you amass is completely up to you, and while some are much easier to get than others, whichever one you're more attracted to will depend on your taste and what element of the gameplay you end up enjoying more. I loved the challenge of finding every cartographer I could and getting to know the lone map makers, but I didn't enjoy trying to be an angler since I couldn't ever get along with the fishing minigame. Because of the lack of combat, Sable is forced to find unconventional ways to make you interact with the game's world, and it's all the better for it. I've always been passively fond of Pikmin, and it's been satisfying to see the upwards trajectory that the franchise has been on for the last decade or so, but it's never been one that I've actively gone out of my way to play. Well, not really. I was lent a copy of Pikmin 2 for the Wii when I was much younger, and I didn't really get what Pikmin was, and with the short-term ownership I had of the game, I didn't get the chance to really keep pushing through and get it to make sense. Because of this, I just had the opinion that playing the games wouldn't be for me. On top of that, I never liked playing as Olimar in Smash either. But seeing the franchise evolve over the years, and passively getting an understanding of what the series actually was and how it played, I softened up, and seeing the bundle of Pikmin 1 and 2 released for the Switch, I couldn't resist the prospect of being able to play through the whole series on just one console. I went into the first Pikmin not really knowing what I would think of it now I was actually giving the franchise another chance, but I never expected that it would immediately suck me in and not really let me go until it was over. There's a running joke that people quickly realise a few in-game days into Pikmin the game is nowhere near as soft and cute as it looks, and the first time you accidentally kill a horde of your Pikmin will be your first wake-up call to this. For me though, when I had that moment of Pikmin mass murder, it clicked just what this game is about. Exploring the compact but detailed areas of the forest to get every scrap of Olimar's ship and defeat each of the bosses is a tough challenge, and the time limit doesn't make it any easier, but that mix of combat, resource and time management and overall strategy ties together and balances so perfectly that you won't want to stop until you've got Olimar back home safe. It's a game-long challenge with a very clear end goal, but unless you manage to waste a massive amount of time, it'll always be achievable. Seeing how efficiently I could collect every scrap and keep my Pikmin supply up is so Moorish, and I know that if I was given the chance and a feed tube, I probably would have done it in one sitting. For a game that's almost as old as me, which has had very little work done to modernise it with support, I was astounded at just how much of a strong first impression it was for the series, and I hope that momentum will keep up when I continue with Pikmin 2. One of the biggest surprises for me as a long-term Zelda fan was just how quickly we got Echoes of Wisdom. For the last decade, it's been years-long hype trains and delays and information droughts for both Breath of the Wild and then Tears of the Kingdom, so having an announcement to release window of less than half a year didn't just feel refreshing, but it felt like a manifested impossibility. Of course, Echoes of Wisdom isn't on the same scale as its two predecessors, but after 11 years, a new 2D Zelda game is just as exciting, especially with Zelda taking center stage for the first time since Wand of fucking Gamelon. I didn't really even have enough time to build up too many expectations since the time between announcement and launch flew by, but it didn't matter since Echoes of Wisdom exceeded pretty much everything I'd imagined. The echo mechanic of copying and pasting, while not something I want to become a series mainstay, was perfect as a one-off to have an entire game based around, and it ended up making the combat some of the most interesting in 2D Zelda, especially when working in conjunction with the sword form and unlockable automatons. And having a massive world you can explore almost however you want to thanks to the maneuverability options provided by the echoes made this the least rigid feeling 2D Zelda to date. While it does a lot new, I'm more impressed by how Echoes of Wisdom borrowed some of the best elements from different recent Zelda games to make something unique but polished. After only getting around to beating the Link's Awakening remake last year, this feels like the correct next stage of evolution after it, and the style of exploration and quest progression felt like it was 2D-ifying Breath of the Wild. Even some of the Echo creations you can put together feel like they're in the same family of thought as the Super Hand Machines in Tears of the Kingdom. Echoes of Wisdom is perhaps the most content-packed 2D Zelda yet, so there's plenty to go back to, but even so, I hope it doesn't take another 11 years to get a follow-up, since I think Zelda's at its best when 2D and 3D titles alternate and coexist. I'm not exactly going to wholeheartedly trust Nintendo to make logical decisions following the success of Echoes of Wisdom, but it's left me hopeful that we won't have too many long Zelda droughts in the near future. For whatever reason, I'd never really given much serious consideration to playing The Last of Us, and I don't really know why. Maybe it just looked a bit too bleak. But after Jay watched the show last year, and we found a copy of the PS4 remaster for a good price, we decided that playing through it together would be a good idea, especially since we had a similarly good time with Resi 4 last year. Maybe I just heard enough people call it overrated, but I was so surprised at how good it was, which for one of the most acclaimed games of all time must be some kind of weird reverse psychology I'd put myself through. Even though I knew quite a bit about the game going in through cultural osmosis, the pacing and dialogue was done so well that I was constantly engaged. I'm very much a decade late to the party, so hitting all the same beats by praising each individual element is a bit overdone. However, one preconception I'd had hammered into me is just how linear the game is, and while that's true, I think that's fully to the game's strength. Each area is designed for you to hit certain beats and be experiencing set parts of the story at the same time, and that just means that everything hits as intended. It would be incredibly strange if you could fast travel to past areas or just turn back around and head to the beginning of the game again, because that would just detract from it. And there are multiple areas where you're given plenty of options how to progress as well as explore. It's just a very well balanced game, and I can see why it's still popular. I'm hesitantly excited to move on to the second game, especially since I feel like I've picked up even more spoilers and details about it since it was only released a few years ago. But who knows, maybe I'll be a contrarian and prefer it. Either way, without any extra context, The Last of Us still holds up, but you probably didn't need me to tell you that. I've always enjoyed classic Tetris gameplay, but I've never had a favourite version of Tetris, just kind of happy to play it on whatever device I can. That was until I played Tetris Effect. Ever since learning about this version of Tetris, I've wanted to try it out, especially since it got rave reviews, which isn't something Tetris usually gets, since it's just Tetris. But after looking into it, I was so sure that I would enjoy it that I waited until I could find the physical collector's edition for a good price since it just looks so good. Luckily, my intuition was correct, and like I said, it's now the ultimate way to play Tetris, at least for me. You might be wondering how Tetris Effect stands out from regular Tetris, aside from the flashy skins on each of its game boards. While the skins are part of it, it's mainly about how the gameplay and the visuals all perfectly align with the rhythm of you placing your blocks. The better you're doing in a level, the music will respond, and it makes the whole experience of playing Tetris almost feel like a rhythm game, except you're taking the lead. You wouldn't think something like that would work with Tetris, but the effort was clearly put in to make sure it would all sync up perfectly. Of course, with the design so focused on music, the soundtrack is a secondary focus aside from the gameplay, and luckily each track is fantastic and lines up with each of the levels to complement each other. Also, having a separate campaign on top of all the different modes gave the game structure to work through, while still having different options if you want a break from the main experience. There's only so much you can say about Tetris Effect without coming back to it's just a really good version of Tetris, or instead getting really pretentious, so I'll leave it at that. A lot of the games that launched this year had years of hype building up to them. There have also been a handful of standouts that came pretty much out of nowhere. Nintendo's best example is Echoes of Wisdom, but Sony arguably had a bigger hit with how much of a moment Astrobot was. Maybe it was just because I played it at launch, but it felt like for a couple of weeks everyone was talking about all the hidden secrets, various cameos, and just polished platforming fun that was packed into Astrobot. Before it launched, I wasn't super excited, mainly because I didn't grow up playing PlayStation, so I knew a lot of the references would go over my head, and also because even though I liked Astro's Playroom when I played it a couple of years ago, it was by no means my favourite thing, and unfortunately felt a bit gimmicky. None of that meant I wasn't looking forward to it since we need more 3D platformers, but I wasn't at the front of the hype train. But Astrobot just did everything right to stand out. Astro has a unique enough control style that he doesn't feel easy to compare to any other 3D platforming hero, and the focus on power-ups in this game meant that none of the levels blurred together. It's clear that the focus was on quality, not quantity, because I was consistently excited to see what each level had to offer, and was very rarely disappointed, and even though I assumed I wouldn't click with many of the references, I was shocked by just how many I recognised, with some of my more obscure favourites like Ulala getting a showcase. Even though it was designed to be accessible, there were challenges in all the right places. Each of the detailed main levels had just enough collectibles that you're unlikely to get them all on your first visit, and while the mandatory levels never got too challenging, there are plenty of optional tougher mini levels to give you something more tricky to work through, and it helps that everything looked great as well. It seems like this game has shot Astro from free demo games to actual video game protagonist, and I hope that momentum continues since Sony are onto something here. While most of the ultra short games I played this year, and when I say that I mean less than an hour or two, while I liked most of them, a lot of them have ended up a bit lower on this list since they weren't able to make enough of an impact to stand out when compared to games that had more time to make an impression. The outlier to this is A Short Hike. You're simply set loose on an adorably pixelated island with a mountain in the middle, and with only a bit of gliding and climbing ability, you're tasked with making it to the top. Of course there's a little bit more to it than that, since there are plenty of friendly faces that you'll run into on your journey up, and while some might just have a couple funny lines of dialogue, others will give you a bit more to do for them. It gives what would be an otherwise pretty basic game a bit more charm and personality, and it just pulls the whole experience together. While A Short Hike is of course limited in scale, that's what makes it all the more surprising with just how much it manages to squeeze in without feeling crowded. Clearly a lot of thoughtfulness is put into placing each of the NPCs to give you and your character room to breathe, but never long enough to feel lonely. I've wondered if A Short Hike was longer, would it have been better? If it was a long hike or just a medium hike, would I have enjoyed having more to sink my teeth into and come back to, or would it have been too much of a good thing? I've settled on the latter since it feels like the length of A Short Hike is almost a feature or a selling point. It feels like the type of game I'll probably return to if I want something sweet I can get through if I want to unwind. Also, if you do want a medium hike, then I'd recommend Little Gator Game, which is about an hour or two longer. But saying that, even though I really enjoyed it when I played it last year, I didn't like it as much as I liked A Short Hike, so I guess that's a testament to my conclusion on whether A Short Hike would have been better longer, as in, it's perfect as it is. I don't need to tell you that there's an oversaturation of roguelites and likes in gaming at the moment. I think we've passed the peak now, and it's not as bad as it was a couple of years ago, but there was a feeling at one point that every other new game had some sort of rogue-esque element. The Groundhog genre has always been a hit or miss with me, with some being absolute gems while others I'd much rather not think about, but one that I held off from playing for a while was Road 96. Instead of being a typical combat-focused roguelike, the game instead roguifies running away from home, turning the road trip to escape the borders of a dystopian anti-teen America into a game of resource management and a little bit of luck. While you get a few opportunities to adjust where you start and your distribution of stamina and money, otherwise you're stranded and have to take advantage of a variety of different methods to traverse up to the border. Instead of being an average driving game, you're faced with different choices for each stretch of the road on how to get to your desired location. You can take the bus, a taxi, steal a car, walk, hitchhike, but for each of these decisions you'll not only need to take your resources into account, but also find yourself interacting with one of the game's recurring cast of characters. The random teenager that's attempting to survive their journey journey to the border with each of your runs isn't ever the main character. Instead, it's this group of people that you keep bumping into and learning more about that pull the main focus. If you choose the bus, you might run into the hacker that's working for the anti-government resistance and have to help them decode a message. Hitchhiking might have you ending up in the limo of a seemingly vapid news reporter who wants you to be her cameraman for some extra cash. Or if you're able to take a break at a roadside bar, you might end up helping the twin thieves with a heist attempt, or instead just play some games at the arcade. Getting to know these characters immerses you in the world, and seeing how their story progresses through your multiple encounters with them is satisfying and makes the prospect of another run enticing. While the writing isn't always perfect, the circumstances and unique lens in which you meet these characters makes it easy to overlook some occasionally cringy lines, since it all feeds into the detailed dystopia that you're exploring. Road 96 definitely isn't going to be for everyone, since there's a very particular blend of genres that I don't think will resonate with a massive crowd, but if you think you click with the premise, then it's at least worth trying. While I've played almost all of Elite Beat Agents before, thanks to my Why Nintendo Owns 2007 video, I was given the perfect excuse to go back to it and actually reach credits. I cover quite a lot of my thoughts on it there, so I won't go into too much detail, but returning to Elite Beat Agents made me realise just how perfect the idea and execution is, and what a shame it is that it's never been attempted again. Rhythm games often struggle to incorporate storytelling in a way that feels natural and doesn't break up the flow of gameplay, and because of this, a lot of rhythm games can feel a bit monotonous to get through, even if the core gameplay is fun. But Elite Beat Agents weaves in its over-the-top comic book stories into each of its levels in a genius way to contextualize what you're doing, while simultaneously complementing the gameplay. And the gameplay doesn't end up feeling like a secondary aspect to the story of each level either, with each song being perfectly mapped and appropriately challenging even on standard difficulty. I have no shame in admitting that the last few levels of Elite Beat Agents had me pulling my hair out, with the last level's marathon perhaps being the worst, requiring near perfection, but that's why it was so satisfying when I did end up finally beating it. I've already bitched enough about why we need another Elite Beat Agents, and it goes without saying at this point really. I don't care if Elite Beat Agents 2 is a first DS game to come out in over a decade, it just needs to happen. After being surprised by how much I enjoyed Slay the Spire last year, I've opened my heart to deck building games, and thank God, because it meant I ended up playing Inscription. Unlike the quite polished and repetitive gameplay of Slay the Spire, Inscription is a lot more chaotic and unhinged, which is a perfect way to reinforce this game's dedication to making you uncomfortable. While Inscription is a gripping deck building roguelike first, it's a horror game second, but what makes it really stand out from all the other horror games I've played is how it implements the horror. While there are more traditionally scary elements, especially near the beginning of the game, as it gets further on, the horror manifests in more fourth wall breaking and alternate reality elements. That already feels like enough of a spoiler, but it's what makes Inscription the kind of game that sticks with you after you finished it, and why it has such a dedicated following of fans that want to uncover all of its secrets, since you're almost guaranteed to miss something the first time you play it. It can be a downer when you get a couple of hours into a game and you quickly pick up on its formula, like you've just beaten the first arc of the story, and then it all clicks into place and you realise that you're going to be doing that again about 5 more times and then the game will be over. Being predictable won't kill a game, but Inscription flies completely in the face of this pattern following and ensures that you won't know what's coming next at any point, whether it's unnerving storytelling interruptions or the gameplay twisting completely for no apparent reason. It isn't just changing for the sake of it though, and the way it can pull off such a chaotic structure is impressive in itself. It's games like Inscription that serve as the best example of gaming not stagnating or getting worse, because it shows off exactly what can be possible when taking full advantage of everything gaming as a medium is capable of. Like everyone who's played a couple of Persona games, I'm of course looking forward to seeing where the series goes next with Persona 6, but even more so now I see what can be done when the formula is given a complete revamp and a new lease of life with Metaphor ReFantasio. The main strength of Metaphor is its world. There is so much effort put into helping you gradually learn about Uchronia's history, the way of life, the different regions, and most importantly the different tribes. The tribes aren't just there for visual diversity, they're all given a good amount of history and have their own dynamic within this world society. The theme of fantasy discrimination is easy to mess up and feel on the nose, but it's done so well that it doesn't feel out of place, and also feels relevant and applicable to real world scenarios. While it feels a little tokenistic having each new party member represent a different tribe, it helps pace out learning about them and just makes this high fantasy setting somehow feel real. But I'm getting caught up in the narrative, and I can't blame myself since it's so good, and being paced with the standard Persona calendar system helps as well. But I haven't even touched the gameplay. The turn-based combat is more fluid than ever, with tweaks to make it less time consuming but still retaining the same level of strategy. Switching out the demon catching and fusing from Persona with a brand new job system called archetypes just makes everything fit together so much better as well. These different archetypes radically change how your character plays and the moves they can use, and mixing and matching is made easy to understand but still has depth, which is not something that can be said for every JRPG job system. And every archetype is linked to the bonds with other characters, encouraging you to work through them as soon as you get the chance, but you don't really need to be encouraged since they're just as good as well. While there are only 14 of these to work through, and I can pretty confidently say that none of them are flops, my personal highlights are Stroll and Heisenberg from the party, but some of the best in the non-party members like Alonso and Brigitte. On top of this, the cast of antagonists are great as well, with Luis being a clear highlight as a big bad, but even the more minor villains shine within their individual arcs. Aside from maybe being a little formulaic, even though it isn't as bad as it can get with how clearly defined some arcs are in other games, the only main issue I have is with graphical inconsistencies. I get that not everything can look perfect, but while some scenes are the perfect representation of what is possible with current gen hardware, paired with some of the most expressive watercolor style sprites out there, but then others look like they're ripped out of a PS2 game. The worst is when you're standing on the deck of the Gauntlet Runner while it's travelling, and it really kills the immersion since it feels like a lot of effort has been put into making everything else look fantastic. Like they didn't need to let you go on the deck while it's moving if it looks like this. Even so, it's a minor gripe, and as a whole package, Metaphor is incredibly strong. I'm still unsure if I want to see more of this world as an extended Metaphor series, or if this is just a perfect one-shot that doesn't need to be built upon. Either way, as it stands now, as a weird cousin to Persona, or perhaps more accurately Shin Megami Tensei's grandbaby, it's just an overall huge success, which I know I have so much more to say about, but I'll leave it at that. After being my most anticipated game of this year and last year, of course my hopes were high for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and as much as it seems like everyone was kind of waiting for it to fail under the weight of the lofty expectations, it managed to come out the other end a gem. It's strange though, and almost impressive how I love this game for some pretty different reasons compared to Final Fantasy VII Remake, the first part of this ongoing remake trilogy for those who aren't aware. It makes sense though, because even though they share a similar look and combat system, the games are structured in a completely different way. I loved Remake because it wasn't an open world, and every area you got to explore, while linear, was packed with so much detail that I didn't really care. But Rebirth isn't a linear chapter-locked game like Remake, and there are a lot more chances for backtracking and wider exploration. In spite of that, the massive world was so consistently well designed and full of fun activities and distractions to keep you busy. I was eagerly jumping at the chance to see everything Rebirth had to offer since it never really let me down. Almost every side quest was rewarding and entertaining, and even if it was one of the less interesting ones, at least I was getting to spend more time exploring the world. While the massive world was one thing, the best part for me was the settlements. Each of the towns was so detailed, alive, distinct from one another, and essentially just everything I want from different towns in a JRPG. I haven't even touched the combat, which is a fantastic progression of the hybrid action strategy system established in Remake, but that goes without saying. More importantly though, while you might think Rebirth is a JRPG, it's actually just a party game disguised as a JRPG. With just how many minigames you'll find yourself playing, and they're not lazily implemented. Most of these games have so much depth that you can easily get trapped and ignore the story for hours, going around the literal theme park and just playing different side games. The crowning jewel of this is Queen's Blood. I'm not one for card games or strategy minigames inside bigger games, and I usually end up maybe giving them one chance and then abstaining if possible. But there's something about Queen's Blood that just kept me coming back, and ending up completing every challenger available in the game. Fuck Gwent, where's my Queen's Blood mobile game? The story of Rebirth is of course given the awkward task of being the middle part of the trilogy, and while that element doesn't do better than Remake, it makes a smart decision to use this part to focus more on the party members and individual character development, and it just means that I'm all the more invested in the cast going into the last part, whenever that finally releases. And on the topic of characters, I already have a whole video on why I think my favourite character in gaming, just overall, Roche, is the best part of this game. But suffice it to say, I was happy with how he was treated in this game, if not a little sad. But that's getting a bit too close to spoiler territory. All in all, Rebirth gives me hope that hype isn't always toxic, since it did end up exceeding my expectations, being both my favourite of all the Game of the Year nominees, and also just my favourite game that released this year overall. And even though it's years away, I can't wait to see how this trilogy finally ends up completing. I wouldn't have expected that a game I was only ever slightly interested in, that I only picked up on a whim because its collector's edition was on clearance, and that after starting I almost ended up dropping twice, would end up being my second favourite of the year, especially with how stiff the competition is. But Sifu isn't exactly a normal game. The only thing I knew going in is that it's a beat 'em up with an aging mechanic where every time you die you're revived but you get older and more frail, but stronger, and while that's core to the game, it's only really part of it. The combat is undeniably tricky to get to grips with, but luckily Honestly, the first couple of levels give you a good few chances to warm yourself up and gives you opportunities to learn, but even then you'll just have to pick things up through trial and error, and also experimenting with a flexible skill tree, and that doesn't come quickly. Paired with just how unforgiving the game is, especially while you're still learning, I haven't quickly forgotten why I almost gave up a couple of times. I don't know when, but at some point it just clicked. While the game's combat is great once you finally learn its ins and outs, what really made me fall in love is each of its 5 levels. The whole game has a distinct use of lighting that varies with each level, giving them a distinct look. That paired with the strong aesthetic choices and twisting layouts of each, there's just plenty to love as you stalk the various corridors of Sifu, slowly learning every room, secret and shortcut like it's nothing. And with each of these levels comes a boss, and they're all honestly fantastic, if not incredibly difficult in their own right, with the 3rd and 5th being the most challenging. Each of the bosses in their stages has an elemental affiliation that's subtle at the start of the level, but by the final phase of your last conflict against them, it's smacking you right in the face, and it's always spectacular. Out of all the games in my top 5 of the year, Sifu is the most divisive, and I fully understand why, especially since my own opinion of it shifted so much from start to finish. But out of everything on this list, Sifu is the one that I'm happiest I stuck with, because of the journey I ended up going on with it. It's also nice that getting the collector's edition was worth it too, but that's just a bonus. Boo, yes I know I'm boring, and yes I know I'm late to the party. This is everyone's favourite game of the year last year, and I don't even think that's really an exaggeration. But since I knew I would at least like it, I waited for the physical release, especially since it's such a big game and the bonuses were so cool. So yes, while I was playing smarter in one sense, I am, like I said, late to the party. But I was right, and I did end up in fact loving Baldur's Gate 3. This is actually a bit painful because how am I supposed to put all my effort into not fitting in when I end up having such a basic top pick? And there isn't really anything new to say about Baldur's Gate 3, especially when it comes to praise, that hasn't been said already. But you see how long this video is, so you know that if I can do one thing, it's find something to say. Ever since I was semi-conscious in the gaming world, I've gravitated towards RPGs, and while I still love them, it's hard to ignore that elements of them can blend together. So Baldur's Gate taking the tabletop approach and fully committing, of course makes it stand out. While I know that it's not the first, it is the first to do so on this grand scale, and to do it so successfully makes it even more impressive. While they're very different games, one thing that I think contributes to why I love Baldur's Gate, which it shares with Final Fantasy Rebirth, is the settlements. While there's something freeing about getting out and stretching your legs in the overworld or a sprawling cave system, I'll always gravitate towards a hub of civilization. That's why I find it hard to relate when I hear people complain about Act 3 being too overwhelming and where they end up restarting the whole game, because getting to explore Baldur's Gate itself in Act 3 was by far the highlight for me that I felt everything was building up to. Yes, there were lots of questlines that start here and just as many that need tying up too, but I didn't care because the streets were also densely packed with things for me to do that I could pace myself and just pick and choose from the last 30 hours of this game like a buffet. You know who didn't have a great time in Act 3? Poor Lizelle. She spent half of it in Orin's torture chamber, kidnapped, and I guess Gale too since he was forced to wear this dress, but the rest of us were having a fantastic time and I think that's impressive. When most other games would be winding down and I would be in sync, kind of looking forward to the game's ending but being able to move on even if I was enjoying it, this last third of Baldur's Gate 3 felt like almost a completely new game in itself. And I'm not just saying all this to shit on the first 2 acts, they were great as well, but what I loved about it is that this game felt like it was a constant upwards trajectory, and because of how malleable the narrative is, I was able to enjoy it for as long as I wanted. I think I spent a couple of weeks telling my friends that I was almost done with Baldur's Gate, and while technically I was, I just kept finding things to keep myself occupied with well after my party's level had maxed out. I've definitely been an avid consumer this year, and while I wouldn't say that I was rushing through most of the games I played, I always kept my eye on the finish line, and I usually wasn't spending too much time on optional content either, especially with the games outside of my top 30 or so. It's how I managed to play so much this year, that and the fact that I played so many short games as well. But with Baldur's Gate, while I always had my eye on the finish line, I wasn't running towards it by any means, more taking the twistiest stroll I could to get there, not actively avoiding it, but just taking in the scenery because it was just too good to ignore. That metaphor was stretched to its limits, but you get where I'm coming from. And best of all, I can replay the whole thing and have a completely different run if I can commit to being evil, but I'm in no rush to go back since I had such a fulfilled and realised complete first run. So yes, I got on the party bus a year late, but now I get why it's still running. Well, that was my top 102 games of the year. Sorry it wasn't an even 100, but it wasn't everything I played. So now you've reached what I'm treating as the epilogue of the video. I'll quickly go over what I dropped early on, what I'm still playing, any live service games, and then a little look at the trends of what I like this year, and a look forward at what I'm excited to play next year. First, what did I drop too early to really consider putting on the list? There's no real order to these, so I'll tackle them by device. The console which had the most drop games was PC, and I just couldn't really get into Townscaper, Mini Metro, Muse Dash or Segue all guns blazing. I'm sure you can find fun in Townscaper if you're the right kind of person, but it's really more of a tool than a game, and it serves that purpose, but I went in expecting something with a little more structure, so that's on me. Mini Metro is a very aesthetically pleasing puzzle management game, but it never clicked for me. I tried a few rounds, but it felt like the game would always get me to a point where failure was inevitable, and that's not really the gameplay loop that makes you want to keep coming back. I don't think I gave Muse Dash the most fair shot, but the rhythm gameplay was just a bit too simplistic. I didn't love the music selection, and for a paid game I was playing on Steam Deck, it just presented itself as a bit too much of a free-to-play mobile game. And while I've always liked the idea of bullet hell games, I've never really gone out my way for them. But when Segue was being given away for free so soon after it launched on Epic Games Store, I thought it was a really good opportunity, but maybe that should have been a red flag. Saying that feels unfair because Segue's presentation looks amazing, but the gameplay was just a little too monotonous while also complex to just not be beginner friendly. Not every game has to be beginner friendly, but as a beginner to that genre, I don't really feel any shame dropping it. On Switch, I dropped Wargroove, Inversus, and Dragon Quest III Remake. I've owned Wargroove almost since it came out years ago, and I tried it for a bit then, but then quickly got distracted and forgot about it. So this was supposed to be my proper attempt, but unfortunately the gameplay just didn't click. I do like strategy games like this, and I really like the game's style, but maybe I just wasn't in the right headspace, or maybe Wargroove just isn't for me. I might try it again in a few more years, but for now I'll let it sit on my Switch. Another game that had years of inactivity on my Switch is Inversus. I picked it up for super cheap, and while I'm sure the aggressive but simple gameplay loop would be enjoyable for some, I would probably like it more as a mobile game, but I'm not booting up my Switch for it. And while I know that Dragon Quest III Remake is an objectively good game, I shouldn't have picked it up at launch coming off the back of two other long RPGs. It had the very tough job of following up Metatron, which I loved, a Mario and Luigi Brothership, which I didn't, and just drained my system for turn-based combat, at least temporarily. I don't know why I thought going straight into Dragon Quest III Remake would be a good idea, but it really wasn't. Then for PlayStation I only dropped Nidhogg. When the Plucky Squire released back in September, it was a day one addition to PlayStation Plus's premium tier, which for a month cost half the price of actually outright buying the Plucky Squire. Since I knew it would be short, I thought I could use the rest of the month after playing the Plucky Squire to see how much I could get from the library of games this opened me up to. This included games like Bound, Entwined, Resogun, Superliminal, Metal Hellsinger, Dave the Diver, Animal World and Road 96, so a real mixed bag. The only game that I tried that I didn't persist to completion was Nidhogg. It wasn't awful, I definitely preferred it to Bound and Entwined, but its simple structure wasn't enough to grab me and keep me playing when I had so many other games on the pass that I wanted to try. Like Inversus, it probably would have been better suited to a mobile game. The only other console that had an early drop was the 3DS, since I really couldn't get into fantasy life. The prospect of getting to choose one of 12 vocations, then living that life in an RPG is enticing, but it immediately got my bad side by having a pompadour-less character creator. And for whatever reason I thought I should choose the most random choice of vocation as a tailor. Being a tailor consisted of fetch quests and a very basic sewing minigame. Maybe I needed to give it another chance with a fresh mindset. Maybe I'll do that with its long awaited Switch sequel, which should come out next year maybe, but for now I'm not tempted to go back. What about the games that I'm still playing? Just to get it out of the way, I haven't picked up Triforce Heroes or Final Fantasy IV 3D back up in the last year. Every time me and the two friends who I'm technically playing through Triforce Heroes with get a chance to spend time together, the prospect of picking up our save at the most awkward dungeon just isn't how we want to spend our time, especially with how frustrating the level we're stuck on is. It'll happen one day, but that day wasn't in 2024. And for Final Fantasy, I just haven't put in the effort to pick up my save since it's at a tricky place in the story, so it's never the most attractive prospect. But for the games I've started this year and still haven't finished, it's quite a mixed bag. Me and Jay recently picked up Mario Party Jamboree, and it's honestly the most fun I've had with Mario Party, but that might be partly because I haven't played many party games like this in recent years, so I could just be desensitized. I wanted to unlock more content within the game while also getting the chance to play it with a few more people before seeing it as complete, so hopefully that'll be on the ranking next year. On the topic of multiplayer games, I also managed to play some of Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed this year. I was tempted to try it out since I remembered loving the original, and while I love Mario Kart 8, it's been played to death, so I was looking for a new racing game to change the pace. It's not bad, but it's not particularly accessible either. The transforming cars and interactive tracks are both a cool idea, but they don't make the game particularly easy to learn, and I had multiple friends complain about the handling, so I didn't really want to force them to keep playing a game they weren't really enjoying. On top of that, it also hasn't aged that well. I played a handful of Wii U games this year, and this one looked the worst by quite a lot. And while it isn't technically a multiplayer game, I did start playing Shadow the Hedgehog with the same friends I should really be playing Triforce Heroes with. The playthrough is technically ironic since the game is notoriously unpolished and just not great, but we do intend to finish, so maybe we'll make more of an active effort to reach that goal next year. I also started playing a lot of different Wii and DS games as part of my 2007 video, and while there are plenty of them I hope to finish, the two I'm probably going to put the most effort towards are Elebits and Hotel Dusk Room 215. Not to shamelessly plug, but more on them in that video. On the note of plugging, I've been gradually working on a video about Final Fantasy 15, so I started replaying that, and I also completed the prequel free-to-play beat-em-up A King's Tale Final Fantasy 15, but I'll save talking about both of those when I finally finish that video, again hopefully next year. And to top it off, I adopted a Nintendo on my 3DS, but since I got distracted by other games, he unfortunately hasn't been fed since September. I hope Kermit is still kicking, but at this point I'm too scared to check. The only live service game I've been consistently playing this year has been Fortnite, and that's pretty easy to maintain since I still play it with friends. This year has mostly been Chapter 5, which was alright and ended up being a pretty middling chapter since while it started strong, the last season ended up dragging it down a bit, being just a bit too obsessed with collaborations. But as now always happens in December, the new Chapter 6 has started and it's already looking good. While the new map is packed, which is a nice change of pace from how sparse some maps can feel at the beginning of a chapter, and the Japanese theme was just a great idea to make the whole thing feel cohesive. The thing I'm the most happy with are the tweaks that were made to movement. Even though wall scrambling, long jumps and wall jumping all feel minor in isolation, they make getting around feel more fluid than ever and have injected new life into the game. The willingness to make important changes like this to stop the game from feeling stale is why Fortnite has been consistently popular for going on a decade now, instead of just being a quickly dying fad. The unwillingness to make changes like this is also why I haven't been tempted to return to Genshin Impact after dropping it last spring. While it's an open world game that could really benefit from the changes made to traversal and movement since it still looks so stiff, the only way they're willing to make changes are on a character by character basis to tempt you to gamble more on the gacha system. So for now I don't see myself going back anytime soon. So after we had so much fun doing it last year, my script editor and part-time data analyst Annie has once again put together some graphs to visualize my taste for the year to see if we could spot any trends, because if your friends aren't making a gaming wrapped for you at the end of the year, then are they really your friends? Starting off easy, we've got how many games played by console. Of course I play more modern systems more often, but I'm happy that there's a bigger selection of quote unquote retro consoles compared to last year. However, I do wish I went out of my way to use my analog pocket more since it only got used once this year for Drill Dozer, so that's something to try next year. I also got the PlayStation VR this year, which is my first foray into VR at all. I never really cared too much about this growing side of gaming over the last decade, but since this accessory has gotten so much cheaper since the second generation was introduced, it seemed like the best way to give it a good chance. On top of that, the games have also gotten significantly cheaper too, but I think it's also worth mentioning that the biggest reason for getting it was the existence of Space Channel 5 Kinda Funky Newsflash. An even bigger change from last year is PC, with 32 games compared to the 4 I played last year. This can be contributed to getting a Steam Deck right at the end of last year and encouraging me to play more PC games. Aside from about half of Inscription and all of keyboard-bound Epistory, every other PC game was played on the Steam Deck, which I honestly loved, especially with the OLED screen, but I did end up hooking it to my TV more often than I thought I would. Now for something a bit busier, the ranking of game based on year of release, and you can also see the distribution by console with the handy color coding. Compared to last year, there's a bit more even distribution of old and newer games, since last year the older games were a bit lower with only a few outliers, but here it's pretty even. Whenever I get the chance, I love to preach and complain about people who claim gaming is dying and on a downward slope, since of course that isn't true, but this graph instead points to a slightly different truth, being that bad and good games are always getting released. Sure, some years are better than others, but still the medium isn't exactly going downhill. Finally, for the ranking based on average hours to beat, while I would love to use my own play hours instead of just using how long to beat, the Switch in particular is really bad at tracking play hours, only using frustratingly vague 5-hour increments, so I ended up using how long to beat to avoid inconsistency, and also for the most part, I tend to have similar play times to their averages. This really visualizes just how many short games I played compared to last year, and that's really how I ended up playing such an exorbitant number of games this year. Of course I still spent a lot of time gaming, I'm not going to deny that. In fact, Annie added together the total number of hours for both this year and last year to see how close they were. I'm not going to share the exact numbers since that will be saved for my intervention, but they both ended up being only 80 hours apart, the length of about one long game, and considering I played 32 more games this year, I think that just puts into perspective how many short games I played. This year I also tended to prefer the longer games I went out of my way to play, with 3 of the top 4 being above 45 hours. And while I ended up dropping both of the long games that were lower on this list, Mario & Luigi Brothers Ship and Shin Megami Tensei 5 for reference, long before they got to the finish time on how long to beat, spending about 15 hours with each instead, I ended up doing the inverse with the longer games. While I played Metaphor for the bang on average 65 hours, for Final Fantasy I played 25 hours more than the average playthrough since I went for pretty much every side quest, and the same extra 25 hours for Baldur's Gate 2, where again side quests and just generally taking my time being the culprit. While the trends weren't as obvious this year, it's always nice to see what I can notice, so thanks to Annie for all her help. So now I've finished looking back, what am I looking forward to playing next year? Well, I've made a sizable dent to my backlog in 2024, there's still plenty to work through. Just to name a few, Shadow of the Colossus, Vanquish, Vampire Survivors, Bioshock, Bugsnax, Alice Madness Returns, Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, The Messenger, Elden Ring, Returnal, Cloudpunk, The Talos Principle, The Outer Worlds, The Outer Wilds, Dragon's Dogma 2, Dragon Age Veilguard. I somehow still haven't played Disco Elysium. I could also dust off my Vita to play Tearaway, and also I finally want to complete the Metroid Prime trilogy before Metroid Prime 4 hopefully finally comes out next year. On top of this, there's a series that I started and want to continue. I played Yakuza, Pikmin, The Last of Us, No More Heroes, Spider-Man, Dishonored, Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk, Little Nightmares and Spyro, all of which have sequels which I'm looking forward to. I can also continue on to the third Professor Layton with the next game, after finishing Great Ace Attorney I'm ready to move on to the main trilogy, and now I've played every Space Channel 5 except the first one, I can go back and play that. I might even return to Nier Automata after finishing Replicant. There's also a couple of games that I haven't played for a while that has sequels I haven't touched. I loved both Gravity Rush and Octopath Traveler when I first played them, and both now have sequels that I'm sure I'll enjoy just as much. And as for games that are releasing next year, there isn't too much confirmed I'm excited for other than Death Stranding 2. But the Switch 2, or whatever it ends up being called, is set to come out next year, so I hope it has a well-prepared launch season with plenty of first-party Nintendo titles. It'll of course be hard to top Breath of the Wild paired as a Switch launch, but if there's anything vaguely close to that, then I'm excited. There's also the chance of Persona 6 news, but I'm seeing that as more 2026. Who knows, we might even hear about Kingdom Hearts 4. I mean, I don't think so, but I can dream. Even though the first chunk of this ranking feels like so much negativity in one section, and it's easy to be distracted by that, I'm honestly just so happy with how much I played this year that I liked and that I loved. Playing more than 100 isn't something I think I'll ever try and consciously repeat, and even though I played some amazing shorter games this year, it's just not something I want to be thinking about as much. But even so, having 80 games which I enjoyed and about 8 which I absolutely adored is something I'm very privileged to have experienced. On top of not caring about numbers as much in general next year, I might also try and go back to replay some of my old favourites more often, even if it's not full playthroughs. Aside from restarting Final Fantasy 15, I didn't replay any games this year, so that might be a nice change of pace to try in 2025. Even so, there is something I find very rewarding about always seeking something new out as well, so there's a balance that can be struck there. Unlike the last couple of years, I don't have many big strong predictions about what I'll like the most. A reason for that is that there aren't any big upcoming releases I'm massively excited for like Tears of the Kingdom or Final Fantasy Rebirth. There are some particular games in my backlog that I think I'll have a better time with, but I guess you'll have to wait until next year to see how I find those. More importantly, if you've gotten this far and you've seen what I've liked and you think there's something that I should really try, comment and let me know, because I'm always looking for games that I haven't considered or maybe haven't even heard of. But on that note,
1, 2, 3.
thank you for making it to the end of what I'm sure is probably my longest video so far. While I always hope people will find and like my videos, for these ranking especially, I do indulgently make them for myself. So if you've made it this far, then I really appreciate your patience. And if you've enjoyed, then subscribing would be amazing. While I do have shorter videos, I have just as many other long ones as well. So if you want to keep up the watch marathon, then there's plenty to choose from. For example, if you like this format and you want to see more like it, you can watch my ranking for last year and see just how wrong most of my predictions for this year were. Or if you're looking for something focused on older games, then last month I did a video looking back at a magazine article from 2007 about why Nintendo would dominate the year ahead, and had some fun with it. Enough shameless self-promotion aside, while I already mentioned it in the last section too, commenting any suggestions or opinions on my placements is more than welcome, since I always want to hear what you thought. And if you're a returning viewer, thanks for being with me this year. 2024 has been a crazy year for me and this channel, and having my audience almost quadruple has been surprising to say the least. It's also been nice to upload more frequently this year. I've taken some multi-month breaks a couple of times, but no massive hiatuses like in 2022 or 23. I couldn't do any of it without Jay and Annie for being involved in almost everything I've posted throughout the year, so thanks again to them. While I said plenty about what I've got planned to play next year, with posting I'm going to be a little more freeform. While my Kid Icarus video feels like a running joke to me in my outros, it will be out one day. And I've also mentioned a planned Final Fantasy 15 video too, but I don't want to rush that either. Maybe something about yaoi, who knows. At this point I've got to pride myself on my unpredictability, but either way I hope you keep an eye out. I think that's gone on enough, so thank you once again, and this is now really the end.